When my son told me I was not welcome for Christmas, I smiled, got in the car, and drove home. 2 days later, I had 30 missed calls. There are people in this world who take a patient man's silence for surrender. They read steadiness as submission, and they read generosity as something they can keep drawing from without ever giving back. They mistake a calm disposition for a man who has no limits. My name is Russell Grady. Welcome to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. If you're new, tap subscribe so the next story finds you without you having to go looking for it. Before we get into things, I'd love to know, is it morning where you are, afternoon, or are you winding down late at night? Drop it in the comments. A quick note. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. 68 years old, retired director of logistics for a major freight corporation. 4 decades spent diagnosing broken systems, untangling supply chain failures, and applying cold, precise corrections wherever inefficiency took root. I built an entire career on the principle that every variable can be measured and every structural weakness can be anticipated. Tonight, the one variable that escaped my calculations entirely was the depth of my own son's arrogance. Christmas Eve air hit like a blade, dry, merciless, working its way straight through the heavy cashmere of my overcoat. I was standing alone on the wide front porch of a large commanding house in an affluent cul-de-sac in Ballantyne, outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The property announced itself the way certain properties do: money stability, the suggestion that the people inside had arrived somewhere permanent. The front lawn was trimmed with surgical precision, its surface glazed with frost that caught the light from the cast-iron street lamps along the sidewalk in hard, sharp flashes. Both arms were occupied with a large, heavy cardboard box braced against my chest. Beneath the lid, each gift for my grandchildren had been wrapped carefully, thick green paper, carefully tied gold ribbons, every corner folded clean. The box dug into my ribs with every breath, awkward and unyielding, but I kept my hold on it. Through the thick mahogany of the front door came the low, thumping pulse of holiday music. Laughter, bright, full, uninhibited, leaked from the windows and moved through the frozen air with an ease that felt almost cruel. Across the drawn blinds of the dining room, shadows shifted and swayed. A party was well underway, inside, wrapped in warmth, I was standing outside of. I moved my weight from one foot to the other, on the icy porch concrete, the soles of my shoes making almost no sound. I made no move toward the doorbell. I stood and I assessed. That is what I have always done. The professional reflex runs too deep to override even here. My breath came out in brief, pale wisps that dissolved into the dark almost instantly. Behind the door, I could make out the faint percussion of crystal on crystal voices, weaving together over what sounded like an elaborate meal. I drew back my cuff and checked the time. 7:55 exactly. I had threaded through holiday traffic with characteristic efficiency, landing precisely when the calendar said I should. The family dinner I had taken as a given, the kind of standing arrangement a father assumes with his only son without needing it spelled out. Or perhaps that assumption was the problem. I eventually extended a numb finger toward the brass doorbell and pushed. The chime rang out deep and hollow through the entryway beyond. The noise inside didn't stop, but the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, rose above it, moving toward the door. The deadbolt turned with a sharp click. The brass handle rotated. The mahogany door pulled back, and a wall of warm air rolled over me, thick with roasted meat, cinnamon, the green bite of fresh pine. It crossed my face like a reprieve. Then my eyes landed on the man filling the doorway, and whatever comfort that warmth offered evaporated on the spot. My son Derek, 34 years old. He was dressed for a successful man's evening, crisp, tailored charcoal blazer, a pristine ivory dress shirt left casually unbuttoned at the collar. Everything about him read polished and composed, until he saw me. The moment my face registered in his eyes, the composure fractured. His shoulders pulled back and locked. The muscle in his jaw flexed visibly. No smile came, no handshake, no movement to one side to bring his father in from the cold. Instead, he stepped forward into the threshold, shoes, planted body, filling the frame. A deliberate blockade constructed from flesh and expensive leather. Music moved behind him in waves. Past his shoulder, I could make out the warm glow of the massive 10-foot Christmas tree, dominating the living room, adorned with hundreds of warm amber lights and expensive gilded ornaments. I held my silence and waited for a word of welcome, for the instinct any son should have had to take the box from his aging father's arms and wave him inside out of the wind. Derek did none of it. His fingers found the door's edge and drew it inward, tightening the opening, narrowing my view of the house behind him to almost nothing. His eyes swept the hallway over his shoulder in a quick, anxious scan, then cut back to me. The shallowness of his breathing was visible. What sat on his face was not a single emotion, but a compound, one irritation and humiliation, and something that crossed into open contempt. His gaze dropped to the box, then climbed back to my face. Merry Christmas did not come. Hello did not come. What came instead was nothing, just the flat stare of a man treating his father like an uninvited stranger who had wandered to the wrong address and interrupted something important. The wind tore at the back of my coat. I didn't move. I stood on the frozen porch and waited for my son to step aside, which he had already decided he would not do. Silence occupied the space between us, dense, pressurized, held in place by the faint noise of the party continuing on behind him, as though nothing on the porch was real. Derek's throat moved as he swallowed. His eyes slid away from mine, unable or unwilling to hold the contact. His weight shifted from foot to foot, his grip on the door's edge unchanged, a man using furniture as a boundary marker. When the words finally came, he kept them barely above a whisper, tightly managed, designed not to carry. "We were not expecting you, Dad," delivered with the flat precision of a system rejection notice. The words didn't so much reach me as land in front of me, solid and cold. I stayed still. The box kept its pressure against my forearms. I absorbed what I had just been told, not expected, on Christmas Eve. Here. Derek's eyes flicked back over his shoulder as laughter cracked through the dining room behind him. "Lacey's family is here," he said, his voice shifting from quiet into something harder, with an edge that bordered on contempt. "It's an intimate gathering. We planned it for immediate family only." Immediate family. The phrase moved through my mind like a recurring line item that refuses to balance. I kept my face still. No visible reaction. No physical tell. I filed the words away and looked past him. The hallway opened behind his shoulder, wide, clean, deliberate in its design. My gaze moved across the custom dark oak hardwood underfoot, gleaming beneath carefully calibrated recessed lighting. The wainscoting on the walls was handcrafted and precisely installed. The entryway floor was Italian marble imported, and my mind, sharpened over 40 years of financial auditing and operational oversight, produced the relevant figures without being asked. $120,000. The certified cashier's check I had delivered personally to the title company 3 years ago. Non-refundable. Drawn directly from retirement savings. The mandatory 20% down payment that made this house a transaction rather than a gift, though I had never once framed it that way. Closing costs paid from my own account without hesitation. Inspection fees the same. My name remained on the deed not as a formality, but as a functional necessity. Derek's credit profile had been nowhere near sufficient to carry a mortgage of this scale on its own. The entire structure, the address, the lawn, the Italian marble existed because I had underwritten it. And tonight, standing on frozen concrete outside it, I was being informed I wasn't family enough to enter. The sharp tap of heels on hardwood filtered out from somewhere down the corridor. I shifted my line of sight. Lacey, my daughter-in-law, 32 years old, came into the hallway, moving with deliberate elegance. She had on a stunning tailored burgundy silk dress and held a delicate crystal champagne flute between her fingers. She came to a stop at the edge of the dining room entrance, her head turned toward the front door. Her eyes found mine through the narrow gap Derek was allowing. Her expression did not register surprise. It did not register confusion. What it registered was precise, quiet knowledge, the look of someone who had already been briefed. She understood what was playing out on this porch. She knew the role Derek was performing and why. For 3 long, airless seconds, she held my gaze. She did not lift a hand. She did not offer a smile. Not one word of greeting. Not a syllable of apology. Lacey simply raised her chin, pivoted on her heel with a dismissive, practiced elegance, and walked back into the warmth of the party, as though the man standing frozen on the porch did not exist. That gesture closed the matter permanently. The reality of the situation. This was not a tragic miscommunication. This was not a scheduling error born from carelessness. This was a deliberate, precisely coordinated exclusion. They had constructed this entire gathering around my absence. Lacey's extended family had been a massive catered feast had been arranged, and the man whose money was literally holding the roof above them had been intentionally left off the list. Derek watched my eyes follow his wife down the hallway. He turned back and set his jaw, bracing his whole body for the confrontation he was certain was coming. He was waiting for the explosion. I expected me to demand entry, voice raised. He expected me to weaponize the down payment, to throw the deed in his face and push my way through the door. He expected the performance of a wounded, desperate father clinging to a son who had already written him off. He was waiting for something messy and emotional, a scene that would confirm every story he'd told himself to justify tonight. He had fundamentally misread the man in front of him. A logistics director does not shout at a broken component. He identifies it, isolates it, and removes it from the chain. I gave him nothing, not a raised decibel, not a flicker of the betrayal working through me beneath the surface. I held a stillness that was not passive. It was surgical. I looked at Derek with the focused attention of someone running diagnostics. I noted the sweat collecting at his hairline, despite the freezing air pouring through the open door. I cataloged the expensive clothes, the locked posture, the arrogance broadcasting itself through his refusal to step aside. The data resolved quickly into a single conclusion. The relationship as a functioning reciprocal unit was finished irreparably and completely. The investment, emotional, financial, spanning decades, had returned nothing. The son I had spent a lifetime building something for the boy, I had shielded and provided for and quietly sacrificed to set up for success, was no longer a real presence in this equation. What stood in that doorway was a stranger who had reduced me to a funding mechanism, silent, distant, expected to keep delivering without question. I smiled. Not warmth, not fatherly affection. A thin, precise curve of the lips, The kind that surfaces across a negotiating table when you realize the other party has just surrendered their only real leverage without understanding what they've done. I bent down and set the heavy cardboard box on the frozen concrete, placing it gently and deliberately at the very tip of Derek's polished shoes. The gold ribbons shifted in the wind. I straightened up, adjusted the collar of my cashmere overcoat against the cold, and faced him. "Merry Christmas, Derek," I said. Level, stripped of anger, stripped of grief, the tone of a man formally closing an account. Derek blinked several times. The tension drained out of his frame in a visible wave. He exhaled long, deep, the breath of someone who had steeled himself for a battle that appeared to him not to have come. He had prepared for combat and received quiet, and he made the catastrophic error of reading that quiet as surrender. He believed he had ejected me cleanly without cost, and in doing so had confirmed some permanent hierarchy between us. "Thank you, Dad." The words came out saturated with a condescension he didn't even bother to conceal. "Drive safe. The roads are getting icy out there." He didn't wait for me to move. The door was already closing as I turned. I didn't linger. I walked down the paved driveway at an unhurried, steady pace. Behind me, the solid mahogany door met its frame with a heavy, definitive thud. The deadbolt drove home. The music cut to almost nothing. The warm glow from the entryway disappeared, and the dark folded back in around me completely. I kept walking toward my car, each footstep pressing firmly into the frost-covered pavement. I did not turn back to look at the house. I did not look up at the lit windows where Lacey's family was drinking expensive champagne in a home my money secured. I walked. And with each step, what had felt like grief burned off in the cold air, and what replaced it was clarity, clean, cold, and absolute. I reached the car, pulled open the door, and lowered myself into the driver's seat. The leather was stiff with cold against my back. The cabin was dark and completely silent. I pulled the door shut. The world outside ceased to register. I held the steering wheel, staring through the frosted windshield at the broad, well-lit street of that wealthy neighborhood. 3 years I had maintained this for him. For 3 years I had stood between Derek and the full financial weight of what he had taken on absorbing the pressure he never even knew existed. I had protected him. I had funded him. And in doing so, I had financed the construction of his arrogance brick by brick. That stopped tonight. I pressed the ignition. The engine turned over smoothly, a steady, dependable hum filling the cold cabin. The dashboard lit up around me in pale blue. My eyes went to the digital clock at the center. It read exactly 8:00 p.m. I sat back and let my mind sequence what came next, not with emotion, but with the operational precision the moment required. The date was December 24th, for 36 consecutive months, without a single gap or delay. An automatic transfer of exactly $3,800 had moved from my primary checking account to cover the mortgage on the property Derek and Lacey currently occupied. The bank had it programmed to initiate at midnight on the 25th of every month, timed to ensure clearance well ahead of the due date. I looked at the clock. 8:00 p.m. 4 hours. 4 hours before the banking system executed that transfer. 4 hours before another $3,800 of my money moved automatically into the accounts of people who had just locked me out in the wind and told me I didn't count as family. I moved my hand to the gear selector and pulled it into drive. The tires found their grip on the frosty asphalt. I didn't pull away in anger. I pulled away with the measured, unhurried deliberateness of an executive authorizing the termination of a loss-generating position. The shift inside me was total. I was no longer a rejected father standing in the cold, hoping to be let in. I was the primary financial stakeholder, and I was moving to unwind a toxic asset. The door hadn't ended anything. It had bought him exactly 4 hours. The drive back from that suburb to my part of the city took 24 minutes. No radio, no heat. The silence in the car was complete, and I let it work on me, letting the cold harden the last soft remnants of paternal sentiment into something fixed and permanent. I turned into the narrow driveway of my townhouse, gray brick slate siding, modest and unassuming by design. No Italian marble inside. No wrought iron at the gate, no soaring entryway built to impress. That had never been the point for me. Efficient. Practical. Low overhead, zero waste. I unlocked the front door and stepped through into the still, quiet interior. In the corner of the living room, a small artificial Christmas tree stood where I had placed it 2 weeks earlier, pulled out of its box in the garage, with the genuine expectation of a holiday shared with family. Its lights were unplugged. The plastic branches dissolved into the surrounding dark. I didn't move to switch them on. That particular illusion had run its course. I took off my heavy cashmere overcoat and laid it across the back of a dining chair with the same practiced precision I applied to everything. I did not settle onto the sofa. I skipped the living area entirely and went straight to the small spare room I used as a home office. That room was my operating base. A solid walnut desk, a leather office chair, and a high-performance desktop computer hooked up to dual monitors. 40 years in freight logistics taught me that the most complex failures get resolved in rooms exactly like this one, quiet, isolated, stripped of distraction. When a vendor went dark or a transport network buckled, I sat in a chair like this and cut the dead weight without ceremony. Tonight, the defaulting vendor was my own son. I hit the power button on the tower. The cooling fans spun up, filling the silence with a low mechanical steadiness that sharpened my focus. Both monitors came alive, flooding the dark room with white light. I sat down and set my palms flat on the desk's surface. What this moment required was complete, uncompromised objectivity. Derek had just shown me without ambiguity that he considered himself a self-made man. He believed his life existed because of his own effort. He had looked his father in the eye and blocked the entrance to a house that only existed because of my capital. It was time for him to meet the arithmetic that had been running quietly beneath his feet this entire time. I launched my secure browser and pulled up the portal for my primary financial institution. My alphanumeric password went in fast muscle memory after years of repetition. My phone buzzed with the two-factor code. 6 digits entered, and the main dashboard expanded across the primary screen. I scanned the organized rows of account data with practiced efficiency. I managed those retirement assets the same way I had managed 8-figure corporate budgets, every dollar assigned a function, a trajectory, a measurable return. I guided the cursor to the tab for scheduled outbound transfers. The page populated with a single recurring entry. The destination account carried the name Derek Grady. The next scheduled execution, December 25th, midnight. The amount, $3,800. I held my eyes on that figure. $3,800. For 36 consecutive months without interruption, that amount had moved out of my retirement reserves and into my son's account, keeping his mortgage current and his illusion of solvency intact. When Derek had come to me 3 years ago in genuine distress over the down payment, I had run the numbers on him. His salary as a regional sales manager didn't come close to covering the monthly payments, the property taxes, and the maintenance demands of a home at that price point. But he had looked at me with something close to desperation, swearing a promotion was imminent, telling me that Lacey wouldn't agree to start a family without a house like this one. So I had stepped in as the invisible hand behind all of it. I placed my name on the deed to make the loan possible, then quietly established this automated transfer to absorb the financial burden his own income could not carry. I had done it out of love. Unconditional, unexamined, weaponizable love. But when an operational resource is turned against the person who funds it, the only rational response is immediate revocation. I moved the cursor over the highlighted transfer entry. The drop-down appeared. I didn't hover over edit. I didn't touch pause. I scrolled to the bottom option, permanently cancel transaction, rendered in red, as though the system itself understood the gravity of the action. I clicked it. A warning dialog appeared, the standard automated safeguard. This action is permanent, future payments will not be processed. Late fees may result. I read every word. I clicked confirm without pausing. A green check mark loaded on the screen. The $3,800 recurring transfer disappeared from the active ledger as cleanly as a line item struck from a manifest. In that instant, the silent infrastructure keeping Derek's curated life from collapse had been removed. But any competent logistics director understands that severing one supply line is not the same as decommissioning a broken system. Every auxiliary channel has to be addressed. I shifted to the credit management section of the dashboard and opened the profile for the joint platinum emergency card. 2 years ago, Derek had called in a state of genuine panic, car transmission failure. No liquidity, couldn't get to work. I had opened a dedicated credit line tied directly to my own credit rating and sent the physical card to his address. The verbal agreement had been explicit and unambiguous. This card existed for true emergencies only. Critical repairs. Sudden medical costs. Basic groceries if they hit a genuine cash shortfall before payday. I found the cardholder control panel within the security settings. There was a toggle on the screen labeled Temporarily Lock Card. I moved past it. I located the stolen card protocol in the security options and activated it, a full permanent freeze with immediate revocation of all authorized users. The confirmation dialog warned me that any cards currently in circulation would be declined at point of sale, effective immediately. I clicked confirm. The card's status flipped from active to frozen. The blade had come down. I leaned back into the leather chair and took a measured breath of the cool, still office air. My financial exposure was now sealed. The main channels of capital flowing into Derek's household had been shut off. But as I looked at the frozen credit account on the monitor, something caught my attention and held it. The outstanding balance was considerably higher than any legitimate emergency use could explain. Before I was satisfied that the defensive action was complete, I needed to understand exactly what had been done with my money. I clicked into the detailed transaction history, approaching it the way I had approached every audit in my professional life, without sentiment, without assumption, without mercy. The blue monitor light sat cold across the dark room. The dashboard for the frozen account came up, the padlock icon, confirming the card was dead. But the outstanding balance in the upper right corner was what mattered now. The number was bold, unambiguous, and deeply instructive. $42,810. I looked at it without moving. The only sound was the steady hum of the computer tower in an otherwise silent house. The total credit limit on that account was $50,000. They had consumed nearly all of it. I clicked into the transaction history. I did not come to this as a grieving father reviewing his son's poor decisions. I came to it the way I had come to every forensic review in 4 decades of corporate logistics. I was auditing a failing asset. I needed to locate the precise points of hemorrhage. I pulled the statements for the past 12 months and downloaded the full data to my hard drive. I opened the first document. The terms of the arrangement established exactly 24 months ago could not have been plainer. Derek had phoned on a Tuesday evening, his voice tightly wound, with what I had accepted at the time as genuine distress. The car transmission had blown. He was stranded. His checking account was overdrawn. Unexpected medical bills for Lacey had wiped it clean, he said. I had listened. I had believed him. I had acted. I had sent the platinum card overnight to their address, with one condition that was not open to interpretation. Absolute emergencies only. Critical car repairs. Medical expenses. Essential groceries in the event of a real cash crisis before payday. It was a safety net, never a supplement to their lifestyle. I started down the first page of the most recent billing cycle. I looked for a mechanic. I looked for a grocery chain, a single charge for staples, for the kind of things people buy when they are actually struggling. There was nothing of that kind anywhere on the page. What I found instead was a charge from 3 weeks ago, $850 at an upscale day spa in the most affluent part of uptown Charlotte. I highlighted it. I put the date against my memory. 3 weeks ago, Derek had called to tell me their hot water heater had burst, and he needed emergency funds to cover a plumber. While I was moving money from my own checking account to keep my son's household from going cold, Lacey was running nearly $1,000 of my available credit through a spa offering hot stone treatments and imported facials. I continued scrolling, clicking through entries with the same methodical cadence I had used on thousands of corporate audits. The pattern of misuse was not buried or obscured. It was open, unhidden, the spending signature of someone who had long since concluded there would never be any accountability. November 14th, $200 at a boutique designer clothing store. November 18th, $400 at an upscale steakhouse charged on a Thursday evening. The same Thursday, Derek had told me he was grinding through a double shift just to stay afloat. November 22nd, $500 paid directly to a private, extremely exclusive country club. I stopped scrolling. I pulled up the itemized receipt for the country club charge. It was not a guest visit. It was the recurring monthly membership due with a dining room tab, attached broken down line by line vintage wines and premium imported steaks. I leaned back in the leather chair and let the full weight of their arrogance settle on me. A country club. They were moving through Charlotte society, projecting the image of a thriving young couple with money to burn, while I sat alone in my modest townhouse quietly covering the cost of the production. I opened the October statement. What the data showed had nothing in common with the version of his life Derek relayed during our brief, pressured phone calls. October 9th, $3,000 in business class airfare to Asheville. October 11th through the 15th, $500 at a luxury ski resort. I remembered that week precisely. Derek had canceled our standing Sunday lunch, telling me he was buried under a critical work deadline and that Lacey had come down with a bad flu. He had sounded worn down on the phone, genuinely depleted, a man trying to hold everything together. I had felt the pull of it. I had even offered to bring food and medicine over. He had turned it down, saying they just needed rest and quiet. The transaction history on my screen dissolved that entire performance. They weren't resting. Nobody was sick. They were sitting in a mountain resort drinking champagne and charging the whole of it to the emergency credit card, belonging to the father they'd left sitting at home. This wasn't a betrayal that arrived in one sharp blow. It was a slow, deliberate, and thoroughly planned extraction. I opened September, then August, then July. The same pattern ran through every month with a consistency that turned my stomach. Thousands of dollars routed into designer boutiques, high-end cosmetic procedures, and lavish entertainment across the board. They had not simply stretched the terms of our arrangement beyond recognition. They had erased them entirely. Their view of me matched precisely what I had begun to understand on that frozen porch. I was not a father to them. I was a mechanism, a quiet, reliable engine of capital built to generate funds indefinitely and ask nothing in return. They had assumed I was either too old to look closely, too trusting to run the numbers, or too starved for their attention to risk the relationship by asking hard questions. They believed my love for Derek would permanently blind me to the glaring financial inconsistencies hiding in plain sight. They calculated that they could keep drawing from me while treating me the way they had treated me just hours ago at that door. They had mistaken my patience for permanent incapacity. What I felt in that moment was not grief. The window for that had closed the instant Lacey turned her back and walked down that mahogany hallway. What had replaced it was something cold, clear, and precise, the focused attention of a man who no longer needed to feel anything to act. Every highlighted transaction on the screen was another brick in the wall going up between us. I compiled the statements and saved them into a new folder on the desktop. I labeled it simply Evidence. The mortgage transfer had been canceled. The platinum card was frozen solid. The financial ecosystem they had built on my credit and my capital was now severed from its source. What followed would be rapid, severe, and entirely a product of their own decisions. I closed out of the credit card portal and returned to the main banking dashboard. I was ready to log off, get some sleep, and let the first phase of the unwinding begin. But as my cursor drifted toward the log out button, a small blinking red icon in the upper left corner stopped me cold. It was a high-priority flag from the integrated credit monitoring service I had carried for decades and rarely had cause to use. My hand stayed on the mouse. The alert was marked Urgent Time-stamped, exactly 3 weeks earlier, buried beneath a backlog of routine notifications I hadn't opened. I clicked on it. The page loaded slowly, the spinning indicator a sharp contrast to the pace at which my pulse was accelerating. I had canceled the mortgage transfer. I had frozen the card. But as the secure message finished loading and the details of the credit inquiry came into focus on the screen, I understood that what I had uncovered so far was only the surface layer of something far more serious. The red alert icon held steady in the corner of the screen. I clicked into it. The secure message center of my credit monitoring portal came up the loading circle, taking its time. My mind ran through the routine explanations while I waited. On accidental flag, a minor identity ping. I had held a spotless credit score for more than 4 decades. Outside of the primary mortgage I carried for Derek, I had no outstanding debt. My townhouse was fully paid off. I was not someone who applied for revolving credit lines on impulse. The page finally loaded, presenting a single detailed alert. It was a formal notification of a hard credit inquiry initiated exactly 21 days ago. The originating institution was not my regular bank. It was a regional credit union on the other side of the city, a branch known specifically for fast approvals on high-risk cash loans. I moved closer to the dual monitors. The alert specified the type of inquiry with precision. It was an application for a home equity line of credit. The approved amount, $75,000. The collateral used to secure that line of credit was the sprawling Ballantine property currently occupied by my son and his wife. I sat without moving. My breathing slowed, deliberate and shallow. I applied the same structural logic to the information on the screen that I had applied to broken systems for 40 years in corporate logistics. I worked through the legal architecture of the asset one element at a time. I had provided the $120,000 down payment for that property. My name and my name alone sat as primary holder on the deed. Derek was listed as a secondary occupant. He held no legal authority to leverage that property as collateral for anything. For a credit union to approve a $75,000 equity loan against that house, they would be required to obtain authorization from the primary deed holder. That meant my physical presence, my government-issued identification, or a fully authenticated signature. I had provided none of those things. I had never spoken to anyone at that credit union. The only conclusion the data supported was the one that materialized now with cold, terrible clarity. Derek had not simply worked around my authority. He had deliberately and knowingly impersonated me. He had forged my signature on federal financial instruments to extract liquid cash from an asset he did not legally own. The air in the office seemed to thin. What I had found on the credit card had been appalling, but it was ultimately a failure of character. Spending my money on spa days and country club dinners was greed, spectacular, brazen, ugly, but it was greed. It was a moral collapse. This was something categorically different. This was a felony. Wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial exploitation. All of it executed in a single transaction with a confidence that was breathtaking in its recklessness. My own son had crossed from entitled dependent into active criminal. I looked at the date of the hard inquiry. 21 days ago. My mind moved back through the calendar without effort. Schedules and sequences are the architecture of how I think. 21 days ago fell in the week of Thanksgiving. A memory surfaced clear and unambiguous, and now sickening to revisit. Derek had invited me over for a short casual dinner on a Tuesday evening, just before the holiday. I remembered sitting at his kitchen island. Lacey had stepped out to run errands conveniently. Derek had poured me a glass of wine unusually relaxed and warm, a version of him I didn't see often enough to question. Partway through the evening, he had produced a thick set of documents from his briefcase explaining they were tied to a new compensation structure at work. He said he needed a character reference signature for a background check a corporate client required. He had spread the pages out, with practiced ease, isolating a single signature line at the bottom of a dense, text-heavy page. I had signed it. I had put my pen to that paper and written my legal name without a moment's hesitation, because the man handing me the pen was my son. He had inserted the loan authorization page directly into a fabricated stack of corporate paperwork. That man had held my gaze, pressed a wine glass into my palm, and steered my hand across the paperwork that signed away my own financial future. My total, unquestioning trust had been the weapon he turned against me, and the yield on that weapon was $75,000 in liquid cash. 3 weeks on, he'd planted himself on an icy front porch, arms spread across the doorframe, and delivered the verdict in a voice like a frozen drain: I wasn't family. Not immediate family. Not welcome. No fists hit the walnut desk. No voice filled the empty room. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. Something deep inside my operational architecture recalibrated slowly, completely, without sentiment. The father who had spent decades bankrolling his son's existence closed up shop for good. What remained was a primary stakeholder staring across the table at a criminal adversary who had been systematically looting his resources. I closed out the credit monitoring site and pulled up the web portal for the regional credit union. The reference numbers from the alert were already in front of me. I used them to trigger an emergency fraud lockdown on the equity line the moment it had been opened. No time wasted navigating customer service menus. I went straight to the automated federal fraud reporting tools. 3 minutes later, the $75,000 account was frozen solid, flagged for identity theft, locked down, and referred for mandatory federal investigation. I kept going. I pulled every available document, the fraudulent application, the time-stamped login records, the scanned forgeries, and built a complete archive in the encrypted evidence folder on my desktop. Every sloppy digital trail he'd left, scattered across the transaction record, was now contained, cataloged, and ready to be used against him. I checked the time on the office wall. Midnight. The second hand crossed the 12. Christmas morning had officially begun, and with it the confirmation that the automated mortgage transfer had not gone through. The joint credit card dead. The fraudulent equity line a federal flag in the banking system. Every financial structure, propping up their posture of superiority, had been wiped from the ledger. I took the phone off the desk. The observation phase was finished. The active phase was starting now. When the corner clock ticked over to 600 a.m., the sky beyond my window was still an unbroken wall of black, no gray edge, no suggestion of morning. Christmas Day. By any ordinary measure, a man my age should have been horizontal under warm covers or drifting awake to the scent of coffee and the low sounds of a family holiday. I was neither. I sat rigid beneath the cold light thrown by my dual monitors, every sense sharpened to a point. Not 1 minute of sleep. No fatigue registering anywhere in my body. My mind was running at the kind of absolute crystalline clarity I hadn't touched since the years when I was managing global logistics networks spanning multiple continents. The man who'd driven out to that wealthy suburb a few hours earlier, half hoping for some ordinary moment of belonging, he no longer existed. That version of me had been cut out and discarded. What occupied the chair now was a corporate director who'd just traced an embezzlement scheme running straight through the middle of his own organization. Through the early morning hours, I worked the evidence sorting, printing, cross-referencing. No detours into old photo albums. No internal audit of my failures as a father. Sentiment is a variable that produces no useful output. I stayed on the data. I ran off the bank logs time-stamped to the second marking, exactly when that fraudulent equity line was opened. I printed the login location records, each one resolving back to the network address tied to Derek's big suburban property. Last came the signature page from the loan application. I held it under the light. My name rendered in a hand that had studied and replicated the angle and rhythm of my own signature on paperwork I had never seen, never signed, never sanctioned. I squared the pages into a clean manila folder, edges flush, no slack. The physical record of a federal crime committed by my son was now a deployable asset. I put the folder down and lifted the phone. Not my personal contacts, I went past those entirely. My professional directory. Gerald Paxton. I stopped there. Gerald was not the kind of attorney who sat across a conference table from weeping relatives and helped them divide assets gently. He didn't do gentle. He was a corporate litigator of the most aggressive variety, the kind of counsel I'd called in throughout my career whenever I needed a hostile acquisition, pushed through a failing subsidiary stripped and dissolved, or a contract-breaching vendor taken apart in court. Sentiment was simply not a category that existed in his professional vocabulary. He operated in leveraged liabilities. He specialized in total asset recovery. The man was a shark who happened to wear a tailored suit. Reaching out to him before sunrise on a federal holiday was not a gesture, it was a declaration. The category of family matter had been retired. What was now underway was the structured dismantling of a hostile entity. I hit the call button. I was not expecting an answer at 6:00 in the morning on Christmas. I didn't need one. A voicemail is a cleaner instrument, anyway. A recorded directive, no social friction, no wasted breath on pleasantries. The line rang 3 times, then rolled to his professional greeting. The tone that followed was crisp and loud in the stillness of the room. "Gerald, it's Russell." The words came out flat, and even every degree of warmth absent by design. Derek forged my signature for a $75,000 home equity line of credit. Draft the 30-day eviction notices and freeze the deed. We go to war on Monday. I lowered the phone and cut the call. The weight of that finality dropped across the room like a steel door closing. But what it carried wasn't grief. It was the specific, clean satisfaction of correct procedure. That house. The outsized performance of success he staged for his neighbors. The polished image, the apparent prosperity, every brick of it, had been mortared with stolen funds and federal wire fraud. The legal sequence I had just set in motion would bring the entire structure down. I pushed back from his desk and got to my feet. Hours of sitting rigid had left my joints stiff, but my back was straight. In the kitchen, dark and quiet, I started a pot of coffee. No television, no holiday programming, no parade coverage, no cheerful noise of any kind. No glance out the window at neighbors moving between houses with wrapped packages under their arms. I sat at the kitchen island with my coffee and let the silence work. The mortgage was severed. The emergency credit card was a dead rectangle of plastic. The equity line was locked inside a federal fraud investigation. The deed to the roof over his head had been converted into a legal instrument aimed at him. His air supply was gone. Every last molecule of financial oxygen cut. I knew the sequence that would follow with the same certainty you know the behavior of a physical system under pressure. Right now, Derek and Lacey were in their lavish master bedroom, asleep with no awareness that everything framing their life had been liquidated in the night. They thought they'd won. They had convinced themselves they'd shed a useless, powerless old man without consequence. 48 hours. That's what the global banking infrastructure would need to surface the full scope of what I had set in motion. I sipped my coffee at a measured pace and let my mind settle in around what was coming. The specific, frantic quality of panic that had no exit. Inside the townhouse, the quiet was total. Outside, the storm was already in motion. Christmas Day produced nothing. No message. No notification. No seasonal greeting transmitted from any direction. The phone sat on the edge of the kitchen island and did not move. In earlier years, that kind of silence would have scraped at me. I would have found some thin pretext to dial their number, just to hear my grandchildren's voices drifting through in the background. That was gone. The silence now registered as data-clean, unambiguous confirmation of what I had already calculated. Remove the financial utility, and I disappeared from their world entirely. The 26th came and went, carrying the same hollow quality. For those 48 hours, I ran my routines the way a well-maintained machine runs its cycles. I shoveled the snow off the narrow driveway. I laid my tax records out in tight chronological order. I cooked and ate with maximum efficiency and minimum fuss. The banking portals stayed closed. I never logged in once. The protocols were self-executing. What I had triggered needed no supervision and admitted no failure. I had cut the supply lines. Now I held position and let the shortage do its work. December 27th opened, hard, raw, cold, no light. I was up at exactly 5:00 in the morning. Shower, shave, clean, pressed shirt and slacks, dressed before the room was fully warm. A retired director of corporate logistics doesn't face a reckoning in his pajamas. I moved to the kitchen and ran my morning sequence. I measured the medium roast coffee beans and dialed in the exact ratio of water to grounds. The machine ran its cycle, knocking and steaming, and the small room filled with a thick, dark fragrance. I poured the result into a heavy stoneware mug, crossed to the kitchen island, and stood without moving. The phone sat exactly where I'd placed it. The display read 7:30 in the morning. Out in the affluent sprawl where Derek and Lacey lived was when the machinery of their lifestyle began drawing from the grid. The boutique coffee order, the premium fitness subscriptions, the automated tolls on their expensive vehicles. All of it began pinging their accounts for daily authorization, one charge after another. I brought the mug to my lips and took a slow, measured sip. The heat and bitterness settled across my tongue. At 7:34, exactly the dark screen of the phone blazed to life. A hard rectangle of light cut through the quiet shadows of the kitchen. The device launched into a violent rattle against the countertop, ringtone drilling through the silence. I did not move toward it. I stood where I was, both hands wrapped around the warm stoneware, and watched. The caller ID burned across the screen in large, unavoidable letters. Derek. The phone rang on the sound bouncing off the cabinet faces. Second ring. Third. It cycled through its full demand before dropping into voicemail. The screen went dark. The kitchen returned to silence. That lasted 42 seconds. Then the screen ignited again. Same name. Same desperate rattling against the stone surface. I took another unhurried sip. The digital guillotine had come down. The financial shockwaves were tearing through their morning right now. Maybe Lacey was at the front counter of her exclusive Pilates studio watching a receptionist's expression shift, while a platinum card came back, declined. Maybe Derek had opened his mobile banking app with a cold knot forming in his chest, finding the mortgage transfer had never posted, and his primary accounts were hemorrhaging into the negative. The phone clicked to voicemail again. Immediately began ringing a third time. I watched the missed call counter tick upward on the lock screen. 3. I had no impulse to pick up the device. Answering would hand them an outlet, a living target they could aim their panic at, something to convert their terror into righteous, entitled fury, directed squarely at me. Silence, by contrast, gives a hostile entity nothing to attack. It forces the reality of total isolation to sit in the room with them, unmediated and absolute. The phone rang a fourth time, a fifth, a sixth. The gap between calls shrank. The rhythm turned erratic. The vibration against the granite stopped being individual pulses and became something closer to a continuous drone. 9 missed calls. 12. I pulled out the stool on the far side of the island and sat down deliberately, keeping my gaze on the glowing screen. 15 missed calls. The desperation radiating off that small rectangle of glass was almost physical. The understanding was arriving for them that the deep, dependable reservoir of my capital had been sealed off permanently and without appeal. 20 missed calls. I pictured Derek moving in tight circuits around his custom kitchen, dialing and redialing, unable to construct a mental model in which his father refused to absorb the fallout of his choices. This was a man who had never absorbed a structural consequence in his adult life. 25 missed calls. The coffee was cooling in the mug, but my attention didn't break. I watched the red badge on the voicemail icon climb. 28. 29. The phone lit up one final time. Derek's name crossed the screen for the 30th consecutive time. I watched the last ring complete its cycle. The display went dark and the counter locked in place. 30 missed calls. The initial surge of panic had reached its peak and broken. Whatever was happening on their end was now past the point of reversal. I sat with the silence that followed the 30th call. It was profound and total. In years of managing global supply chains, I had come to understand that the most decisive moment in any structural failure is not the breach itself. It is the interval directly after, when the failing components register that no recovery protocol is coming. I knew precisely what was unfolding on their side of the network. The arrogant assumption that this would be fixed was curdling fast into something rawer and more fundamental. They were reaching for alternative credit lines and finding each path blocked or already bled dry by their own excess. They were refreshing their banking apps in a loop, hunting for some digital anomaly that would restore what they had come to treat as their permanent entitlement. I drained the last of my lukewarm coffee and set the stoneware mug down on the counter with a quiet, dull sound. The preparation phase was complete. For 3 years, they had treated me as an invisible automated service, a utility that processed payments and generated no value of its own. They were now entering the next phase, discovering what occurs when that utility acquires full awareness and initiates a deliberate and total system purge. The screen showed 30 missed calls and held that number without wavering. The rattling against the countertop had gone still, leaving nothing behind but a dense quiet in the kitchen. I didn't move right away. I let the stillness accumulate around me. I finished the last drops of my coffee and placed the mug in the sink. Dried my hands on a cloth towel. Only after that did I return to the island and lift the phone. I unlocked it and opened the voicemail application. What I found was a long, cascading column of audio entries. Every single one was from Derek. I did not feel the reflex pull of a worried father scanning for signs of danger. What I felt was the flat, focused attention of a corporate auditor working through a sequence of logged system failures. I pressed play on the first message recorded at 10:15 in the morning. It opened with a sharp exhale, impatient, irritated. Behind his voice, I could make out the unmistakable ambient texture of a high-end retail environment. Soft classical music filtered through the overhead speakers. The murmur of well-dressed shoppers moved around him in the background. When Derek spoke, the condescension was thick enough to coat the speaker. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the holiday. He went straight into a reprimand, as though addressing an employee who had filed a report incorrectly. I wanted to know why their joint platinum card had just been declined at the register. He explained with the particular irritation of someone unaccustomed to inconvenience that they were at an exclusive post-Christmas designer clearance event. He said Lacey was standing at the checkout counter right now being publicly humiliated while the terminal flashed a restricted account error. Somewhere close to the receiver, I could hear Lacey's voice, low and sharp, the words indistinct, but the fury unmistakable. Derek addressed me the way you address a junior employee who forgot to run a scheduled update. He told me to contact my financial institution. He told me to correct whatever technical error I had apparently introduced, and to call him the moment the funds were available. The recording ended with a hard click. I didn't flinch. I felt no guilt whatsoever about Lacey's moment of public embarrassment. The money they were trying to spend on designer merchandise had been extracted directly from my retirement savings. What happened at that register was not a glitch. It was a permanent barricade. I hit delete and kept moving down the list, skipping past a succession of repetitive angry messages demanding to know why I wasn't picking up. The next message I stopped on was time-stamped 1:45 in the afternoon, and the tone had shifted. I pressed play. The environment in this recording was completely different. No retail music. No background crowd. Just the low, steady idle of a luxury vehicle engine. Derek was alone in his expensive SUV. Every trace of the entitlement that had saturated his first message was gone. What had replaced it was something tighter, more pressurized. His voice had risen in pitch. He was speaking quickly, losing the thread slightly as he went. He told me he had received an automated alert from his primary lending institution. The $3,800 mortgage payment had failed to clear. The bank had issued a formal default warning. He worked to rationalize it, tried to fold the catastrophe into something manageable. He suggested I must have made some careless error navigating my online banking. He invoked my age, theorizing that I had probably clicked the wrong option and accidentally disrupted the routing automation. He instructed me to wire the funds directly to his checking account before a penalty hit his credit score. I was still gripping the frame of his manufactured independence. He still believed at his core that he was dealing with a confused older man who had fumbled a routine task. He could not yet bring himself to face the alternative that the host had acted with full deliberation and the parasite had been cut loose. I hit delete again, purging his anxiety from the record. I jumped to the final voicemail on the list left just minutes before. I raised the phone and pressed play. This was where the real terror had arrived. Derek was barely holding it together. His breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts, loud against the microphone. His voice broke apart as he spoke, every trace of corporate polish and entitled authority completely dissolved. He wasn't issuing demands anymore. He was begging. The bank had reached him directly on his personal line. The representative had told him the $75,000 home equity line of credit was permanently frozen. Not a system error, not a processing delay. The Federal Fraud Department had locked it down on suspicion of identity theft and financial exploitation. Derek stumbled through the recording words, tripping over each other. He told me fraud investigators were actively examining the digital signatures on the application. He said local authorities might be legally required to look into the loan's origins. He told me to call the bank that instant. He begged me to contact the federal investigators and tell them it was all a family misunderstanding. He wanted me to lie to federal authorities on his behalf. I expected me, because he was my son, to voluntarily absorb the criminal liability for what he had done to stand between him and a felony charge in order to preserve the gilded lifestyle he had constructed entirely on capital he had stolen from me. I listened to that raw, unfiltered panic as the walls of his fraudulent world compressed around him. Federal indictment, forced eviction, financial collapse, all converging within a 48-hour window. The voicemail cut off mid-plea, and the kitchen settled back into total silence. I lowered the phone and set it face down on the countertop. No pity registered. Not a trace. I had just audited the full cascading sequence of his unraveling voicemail by voicemail, each one functioning as hard confirmation that the strike had executed with clean, mechanical precision. The threat had been neutralized. The broader operation, however, was nowhere near finished. I stepped away from the island and moved toward the front closet. I drew my heavy cashmere overcoat from the hanger. The intelligence picture was complete. The adversary was disoriented and bleeding resources in every direction. The time for sitting in the quiet of the townhouse was over. It was time to go uptown and take a seat in the war room. I pulled the coat on, prepared to see the full eradication through. The elevator rode smoothly to the 42nd floor and opened onto the reception area of Paxton and Vance litigation. It was precisely 8 in the morning on the Monday after the holiday weekend. The front desk was unmanned. Through the glass walls, the frozen uptown skyline stretched across the horizon, but I had no interest in the view. I moved straight down the polished marble corridor toward the corner office. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy door open and walked through. Gerald Paxton was already behind his massive glass desk. No manufactured pleasantry. No remark about the holiday. No smile of greeting. He was in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, attention fixed on his laptop screen. In the center of the desk sat a thick printed file, the encrypted data package I had transmitted to his secure server 2 days prior. "Have a seat, Russell." Gerald spoke without lifting his eyes from the monitor. His voice was a flat, gravelly baritone, with nothing warm in it. I settled into the leather chair across from him. I kept the cashmere overcoat on. I waited. Gerald closed the laptop and laid both hands flat on the glass. He looked up and fixed me with his measuring gaze of someone calculating the dimensions of a problem. I went through the entire data package you put together. The login timestamps, the network routing addresses, the scanned application from the regional credit union. I cross-referenced the document metadata against the forged signature page and ran the legal classification. He paused for a beat. It is a bloodbath. He leaned forward slightly. Your son didn't simply bend a few internal banking rules. By transmitting a forged signature electronically to secure a $75,000 equity loan against an asset he has no ownership stake in, he has triggered a range of serious federal and state statutes. We are looking at aggravated identity theft. We are looking at first-degree felony forgery. Because the credit union is a federally insured institution, the electronic submission pushes this squarely into federal wire fraud territory. And given your age bracket, he has crossed the line into severe elder financial exploitation. Gerald let the weight of that inventory sit in the room for a moment. If the district attorney decides to pursue this with any aggression, and given the spotless paper trail you've handed them, they will. Your son is staring at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Not a fine rustle, not probation. Hard time. I absorbed that the same way I used to absorb a quarterly earnings report, without flinching, without sentiment. No protective instinct surfaced. He had walked into a minefield of his own design and planted his foot on the largest charge he could find. I'm not moving to initiate criminal proceedings today. I kept my eyes level with Gerald's. Criminal investigations run for months. Detectives, grand juries, procedural delays stacked on top of each other. Derek would use every week of that runway to work on his wife, pull money from her family, and build out a narrative of himself as the wronged party. I don't want to hand him a timeline. I want to administer a total systemic shock. I want his entire operational reality taken apart immediately. Gerald tilted his head slightly, something close to professional appreciation passing across his expression. He opened the file and drew out a copy of the property deed. You hold the primary deed. Derek and his wife have no formal lease agreement. Legally, they're tenants at will. I can draft a standard 30-day notice to quit today. Once the period expires, we file for formal eviction in county court. Physical removal runs roughly 60 to 90 days after that. I shook my head. 90 days is completely unworkable. That window gives him room to secure alternative housing, retain a defense attorney, and move his assets out of reach. 90 days lets him breathe. I need him suffocating by next week. Gerald leaned back and turned a silver pen slowly against the glass surface of the desk. You want to bypass the eviction track entirely. I want to liquidate the asset. My voice dropped into a register that left no room for negotiation. I spent 40 years inside global corporate logistics. When a regional distribution center collapses because someone on the inside was looting it, you don't spend 90 days walking the corrupt managers toward the exit. You dissolve the entity. You liquidate the inventory, sell the land, and torch the lease. I don't want that house back, Gerald. I have no interest in managing it or putting tenants in it. I want it sold. I want it sold out from under them while they're still sleeping in the master bedroom. Gerald set the pen down. A slow, deliberate smile crossed his face. He understood the architecture of exactly what I was building. Selling an occupied property is a notoriously difficult maneuver on the open market. Conventional buyers require walkthroughs, structural inspections, vacant rooms. An occupied home, especially one where hostile family members are facing eviction, sends buyers running. Then we don't go near the conventional market, I answered without hesitation. We use a corporate liquidator. Gerald nodded, already pulling up the relevant framework in his mind. I have a standing relationship with a private equity group, Apex Capital Holdings. Large corporate entity built around rapid cash acquisitions of distressed or heavily encumbered residential properties. They buy entirely sight unseen. No inspections. They don't concern themselves with current occupants because they maintain an internal team of corporate litigators whose entire function is executing fast, hostile evictions. They'll purchase the property with your son still on the sofa and have him removed without a moment's hesitation. That is precisely the mechanism I need. The clarity of the strategy was sharpening everything. What's the trade-off? The margin. Gerald's tone shifted back to pure business. Apex Capital takes on significant legal risk and physical liability when they buy an occupied property without inspection. They price that risk into every acquisition strictly below market value. Your property currently appraises at roughly $850,000. What I was about to uncover went far beyond anything I had allowed myself to imagine. The full weight of what my own son had been doing quietly, deliberately over time was about to land all at once. Before we get there, I want to ask you if someone you loved and trusted was working against you in secret. Would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you gather every piece of evidence first and say nothing? Apex will come in at 80 cents on the dollar. You'll absorb a significant financial hit. The arithmetic was instantaneous. 20% of $850,000 was $170,000. I was looking at walking away from nearly $200,000 in pure equity. For a fraction of a second, the sheer scale of that loss registered. Then I set it aside. This was not a real estate transaction. It was a tactical military expenditure. I'll take the 20% loss. Not a tremor in my voice. In fact, I want you to put the property to them at exactly that discounted figure right now. No negotiation, no counteroffer. Hand them the floor price immediately. Gerald raised an eyebrow. You're deliberately bleeding your own capital, Russell. You're paying a premium for vengeance. I'm paying a premium for velocity. I cut back sharply. I know how corporate equity firms operate. If we push for fair market value, the file goes to an underwriting committee and sits there for 3 weeks. But if we hand them a clean property in an affluent neighborhood at a guaranteed 20% discount, the internal algorithms approve the acquisition automatically. It becomes an asset transfer they can't pass up. At that discount, what does the closing timeline actually look like? Gerald drew a sheet of heavy bond paper from a drawer and laid it flat on the glass desk. If we offer the 20% discount today, they bypass underwriting entirely. They can wire the funds and execute a clean title transfer in exactly 7 days. Next Monday. I repeated those 2 words in my mind, tasting the full weight of their finality. By next Monday, my son would no longer be occupying a house that belonged to his father. He would be trespassing aggressively, illegally, on private corporate property owned by a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. Gerald uncapped his silver pen and began drafting directly on the sheet specific property coordinates, the discounted purchase price, the guaranteed 7-day closing window. He rotated the document and slid it across the smooth glass toward me. The pen rested on top of the paper. Your son used your forged signature to steal $75,000. Gerald's voice dropped to something quiet and absolutely serious. Use your real signature to burn his world to the ground. I reached out and took the pen. The metal was cold and solid in my hand. I looked down at the single black authorization line at the bottom of the page. For 3 years, Derek and Lacey had treated me as a silent, inexhaustible machine. They had dismissed me, mocked me, and ultimately moved to destroy me financially. They had operated under the belief that their actions would never produce a consequence. I set the tip of the pen against the paper. No hesitation. I executed my signature in bold, sweeping strokes, binding the total liquidation of their manufactured reality into law. I returned the pen to the desk. Gerald drew the document back without a word. He turned to the scanner, digitized the contract, and transmitted it directly to the acquisition directors at Apex Capital Holdings. The transfer took less than 5 seconds. The mechanism was locked. The countdown was running. Next Monday, the storm would break. The drive back from the uptown financial district to my townhouse took exactly 47 minutes. I left the radio off. I drove in silence, the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against cold pavement, the only anchors for my thoughts. The meeting with Gerald had converted abstract data into a tangible weapon. The listing agreement was signed and transmitted. The 30-day eviction track had been bypassed entirely. In exactly 7 days, an acquisition team from Apex Capital Holdings would hold legal title to the property Derek currently occupied. The guillotine hadn't merely dropped. It had taken out the entire foundation their stolen existence was built on. I turned off the main thoroughfare and wound through the residential streets back to the townhouse. The winter sky sat flat and colorless above the bare trees and frost-stiffened lawns pressing down without mercy. What I felt was a profound operational calm. The string of frantic voicemails Derek had left throughout the morning had confirmed his total disorientation. How was a man who had spent his adult life maneuvering around minor inconveniences, but he had no mental architecture for a complete systemic collapse? He expected me to pick up the phone and absorb his panic like I always had. He expected me to respond like a compliant subordinate. My sustained silence had clearly pushed him past the point of rational function. As I rounded the final corner toward my property, the operational calm locked into something harder and more precise. I eased the vehicle down to a crawl. The narrow driveway leading to my attached garage was completely blocked. A large, gleaming black luxury SUV sat wedged aggressively across the apron, not parked with any consideration for the space, but planted diagonally, rear tires, compressing the frosted grass of the front lawn, front bumper, jutting out across the sidewalk. It was not a parking decision. It was a territorial statement. I recognized the vehicle without any effort. It was the $75,000 flagship model Derek had leased 18 months ago, insisting it was a non-negotiable requirement for entertaining his premium corporate clientele. He had funded those substantial monthly payments using the exact same fraudulent financial leverage I had spent the last week dismantling. I brought the car to a complete stop in the center of the street, engine idling, and observed the scene through the windshield. Derek and Lacey were on my small concrete front porch. They weren't standing in the posture of family members seeking a quiet resolution. They were moving, pacing back and forth in tight, agitated circuits across the narrow space like cornered animals that hadn't yet found the exit. The winter air was clearly biting into them, but their entitlement seemed to generate its own insulation. Lacey had pulled a thick designer winter coat around herself, arms clenched across her chest. Her face was set in an expression of concentrated, unadulterated fury. One expensive leather boot tapped a hard, impatient rhythm against the concrete as she stared at my locked front door as though she could force it open through sheer force of will. Derek was in constant, erratic motion, in a suit jacket far too thin for the temperature, apparently indifferent to the cold. He was cycling through the same routine phone to ear, a few seconds of listening, then the device yanked away, and his thumb hammering the screen. I was trying to reach me again. Standing on my property, blocking my driveway, and expecting my phone to ring inside my empty house. I sat in the idling car and watched them with the same detached metrics I used to evaluate a failing vendor at a loading dock. Neither one of them showed a single sign of remorse. No sorrow for what they had engineered. Nothing but the raw, toxic agitation of parasites who'd suddenly lost access to their host. They hadn't driven across the city to apologize for forging my signature on federal banking documents. They'd come to corner me on my own ground and force me to restore their access to what they had stolen. They still believed that if they could get me physically in front of them, they could lean on me, intimidate me, and walk me back into compliance. They still read me as a weak, solitary old man who could be broken with enough pressure. They had not yet grasped that the father they had always counted on ceased to exist the moment he was turned away from a frozen porch weeks ago. What they were currently trespassing against was an adversary who had just absorbed a 20% loss on a property sale specifically to deny them the luxury of a slow eviction. I lifted my foot from the brake and let the vehicle roll forward until the front bumper came within inches of the polished black door of Derek's aggressively positioned SUV. The tires ground against the accumulated road, salt and frozen gravel, the sound cutting clean through the quiet suburban air. Lacey caught it first. She stopped pacing, eyes snapping to my car. Her posture shifted in an instant from coiled irritation to something sharper and more aggressive. She reached over and hit Derek hard on the shoulder, leveling a manicured finger directly at my windshield. Derek pulled the phone from his ear and turned to face the street. His face was flushed deep red from the cold and whatever adrenaline had been running through him all morning. For a fraction of a second, in the moment, his eyes found mine through the glass. I could see the raw, unguarded desperation underneath the expensive suit. That flicker of recognition, the awareness that his fraudulent world was collapsing in real time, was visible for only an instant before it got buried under a wall of blinding entitlement. His jaw locked. His hands drew into white-knuckled fists at his sides. Whatever remained of the polished corporate sun dissolved on the spot, leaving only the volatile, cornered criminal beneath. No wave, no movement to clear the driveway. He let out a shout of raw fury that plumed white in the frozen air, then launched himself off the porch, hit the frosted grass hard, and came toward my car. I cut the engine. The only sound was the winter wind carving across the concrete. I took the door handle and stepped out into the cold. I didn't get the door fully closed before it started. Lacey covered the distance between us fast. Her face burned red against the gray morning. Her manicured hands drew into fists at her sides. No inquiry about my health. No greeting of any kind. She went straight into a high-pitched, piercing torrent of accusations, all basic decency stripped from her voice. She informed me I had deliberately ruined her morning. She laid out in excruciating, entitled detail how she had been standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive uptown boutique, surrounded by her entire social circle, and handed her platinum emergency card to the cashier, only to watch the machine reject it flat. She demanded an explanation for how I could be so spectacularly selfish as to freeze my own credit line without a word to her. I stood beside the car without moving, hands resting quietly on the cold metal of the roof, observing her the way you observe a piece of equipment that has begun to malfunction. Her breath clouded the air in short, furious bursts as she went on about the social humiliation of a declined transaction at a high-end register. She genuinely believed that moment of retail embarrassment was the defining catastrophe of the morning. She had no concept that the card in her hand had been funded by stolen capital, or that the man beside her had committed a federal felony to keep her lifestyle operational. Derek stepped in and placed a hand on Lacey's arm, pulling her back. He had clocked that her tirade was producing no visible effect, that it was bouncing off my silence without leaving a mark. He shifted modes, adopting the measured, authoritative posture he deployed when managing difficult clients in a sales negotiation. He straightened the collar of his thin suit jacket, visibly fighting off a shiver in the biting cold. He looked at me with a carefully constructed expression of deep disappointment, head moving slowly from side to side as though handling a confused and difficult elderly relative. He told me that my little clerical error with his banking application had triggered an inconvenient glitch. He explained that the bank had overreacted to a routine routing discrepancy and slapped a fraud alert on the home equity line. He instructed me to take out my phone on the spot, dial the fraud department, while he stood there verbally authorized the release of the funds and formally apologized to the banking representatives for the confusion I had caused. He was actually attempting to convince me that the federal lockdown on his criminal loan was a product of my elderly incompetence, a mistake I owed it to him to correct immediately. I didn't reach for my phone. I held his gaze without expression. The unbroken silence worked on him visibly. The corporate composure began fracturing the raw panic underneath, pushing through the surface. When he realized no verbal command was going to produce compliance, Derek reached inside his jacket. He produced a thick, leather-bound clipboard and pushed it across the hood of my car. A dense, closely typed legal document was clamped to the board. He spoke fast, his words overlapping in their urgency. He told me that since I clearly couldn't manage my own banking applications, he'd taken the initiative and brought a solution directly to my door. He described the document as a standard administrative release form designed to clear the fraud alert, unfreeze the $75,000, and permanently transfer primary administrative control of the deed into his name, purely to eliminate any future confusion. I was asking me to stand on my own frozen driveway and voluntarily sign away my home in order to legitimize the crime he had already committed. I looked down at the document. Before I could say a word, Derek snapped his fingers toward his idling SUV. The passenger door swung open. A man climbed out onto the driveway who looked nothing like a banking official or a legitimate legal representative. He wore an ill-fitting, wrinkled overcoat. He was sweating in spite of the temperature, his eyes moving in quick, nervous sweeps up and down the quiet street. He gripped a small, worn leather satchel tight against his chest. Derek introduced him with a dismissive flick of his hand, a licensed mobile notary, a professional, someone he had paid a significant premium to bring directly to my address during a holiday week. He slapped the hood of my car and told me to put the clipboard down, sign the release authorization, and let the notary do his work. The full dimensions of the ambush settled over the scene. Derek hadn't simply come to argue. He had arrived with a compromised notary to physically surround me on my own property. 3 younger adults arranged to intimidate, pressure, and coerce an old man into executing a fraudulent legal instrument on his own driveway. The notary shuffled forward, boots dragging on the frost, eyes averted. He reached into the worn leather satchel and pulled out a heavy steel ink stamp, hands unsteady as he worked off the cap. He was clearly someone who operated well outside the boundaries of legitimate practice, sourced most likely through the same network Derek had tapped for his quick cash loans. "Sign it, Russell." Derek dropped the pretense of calling me Dad entirely. His voice came out harsh and pressured, nothing left of the earlier corporate tone. "Sign it right now. You are not going to destroy my life over a technicality. You will sign the release and we will walk away from this, or I swear to God, I will have you declared legally incompetent and take the estate regardless." The words hung in the frozen air. He had finally exposed the full depth of what he was willing to do, threatening to strip me of my legal autonomy and have me institutionalized, all to preserve his access to my money. I looked at Lacey's arms, still locked across her chest, eyes burning with poisonous entitlement. I looked at the sweating notary turning the steel stamp in his trembling hands. Then I looked directly into the bloodshot, panicked eyes of the man I had raised. Every one of them was waiting for the same thing. The elderly father folding under physical pressure, confusion, fear, a desperate lunge towards some form of family reconciliation. They were certain the confrontation would break me. I gave them nothing they anticipated. I stood straight, unmoved by the cold or the hostility surrounding me. I reached out and set my bare hand on the edge of the leather clipboard. No pen came out of my pocket. I simply shifted my eyes to the shivering notary. "If you press that stamp against a single sheet of paper on my property," I said, my voice coming through the street noise like a blade through fabric, "I will personally see to it that you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for participation in an active wire fraud conspiracy." The notary recoiled as though struck. The steel stamp dropped back into the leather satchel. He took 3 rapid, stumbling steps away and kept going, shaking his head as he retreated. Derek lunged forward and drove both hands down onto the hood of my car, a last detonation of fury from a man who had no idea that every intimidation tactic he owned was useless against someone who had already signed the papers dissolving his world. Derek's advance stopped the moment he absorbed that his physical pressure had produced nothing. He stood on the frost-covered concrete chest, rising and falling, under the thin jacket, watching the notary's taillights disappear down the street. Then his eyes came back to me. I watched the mechanism turning behind his face. The brute force strategy was gone and he had nothing to replace it with. What came next was a physical transformation I witnessed unfold directly in front of me. The furious red faded from his face. The rigid, aggressive line of his shoulders came down. One long breath pushed out into the cold, and something shifted behind his eyes. The cornered criminal evaporated on the spot, replaced without a seam by a devoted, anguished son, radiating manufactured concern. "Dad, you are clearly not well." Derek's voice descended a full register, smooth, measured, almost tender. "You are confused. The choices you're making are completely irrational, and they are edging toward genuine danger." Both hands came up, palms turned outward, and he eased toward me with the deliberate patience of someone approaching a spooked animal. Right there on the iced concrete, he began constructing an entirely alternate version of the preceding 48 hours. My memory, he told me, was self-evidently slipping. Dripping with synthetic sympathy, he floated the explanation that I had simply failed to keep up with the monthly bills. The frozen credit card at the boutique and the failed mortgage transfer, he declared, were not calculated strikes, but the heartbreaking errors of a mind in serious deterioration. He insisted I must have logged into my own banking portals and garbled the routing numbers in a fog of cognitive collapse. Lacey read the tactical pivot the instant it happened and glided smoothly into position at his side. She cinched her expensive designer coat at the waist and turned a face toward me carved from exaggerated theatrical grief. "Russell, it was so terribly embarrassing for you." The words came out barely above a whisper, her voice engineered to tremble with sympathy she did not feel. The cashier at the boutique was so worried when the card declined. She asked if you were suffering from dementia. She asked if you had forgotten how to manage your own accounts. "We are just so incredibly worried about you, Russell. You are acting so erratically. You are destroying your own life because your mind is failing." I kept both hands flat on the cold roof of my vehicle and did not move. No blink, no defense of my faculties, no rebuttal against the fiction they were assembling in real time. What I did was register the raw, staggering nerve of the operation. They were occupying the driveway of a home I had paid for, pressing me for money I had built, and working in tandem to reframe my resistance as evidence of neurological decay. I clocked the exact grip Derek had on that clipboard, fingers blanched at the knuckles, the pages shivering in the bitter wind. What he was running was a psychological, hostile takeover. The goal was to make me distrust my own perception of events. He needed the load-bearing walls of my own mind to feel unsound. Strip a target of his grip on reality, then slide the contract across the table. It was a maneuver straight out of the corporate predator's playbook. Derek advanced another half-step, fingertips drumming lightly on the leather clipboard he had already once tried to force into my hands. Not a word about the fraudulent equity line. Federal wire fraud, the specific charge I had leveled minutes earlier, went completely unaddressed. He studied the packed legal text, then raised his eyes back to mine, wearing the expression of a man crushed beneath a burden he never asked to carry. "I brought this paperwork to help you, Dad." Every syllable was soaked in the language of reluctant duty. "It is not an administrative release. It is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It gives me full medical and financial proxy over your estate. It is strictly for your own good. You are clearly struggling to manage your daily existence. You are forgetting to execute basic financial transfers. You are pushing away the only family you have left. I need you to sign this document today so I can take the heavy burden off your shoulders. Let me step in and manage the accounts before you accidentally bankrupt yourself in a state of severe confusion." He extended the clipboard toward me as though he were lowering a rope to a man already going under. What he was really offering was the legal mechanism to hollow me out entirely, authority to drain my retirement accounts, encumber my townhouse, and dismantle everything I owned under the airtight cover of a state-endorsed document. When my hands stayed where they were, the performance curdled. The warmth in his face didn't fade gradually. It calcified. A cold and absolute menace pushed through whatever surface concern had been there before. He dropped the clipboard an inch and closed the distance until his exhaled breath reached my face in the frozen air. "Dad, I am trying to do this the easy way." Derek murmured, the soft register gone, replaced by something flat and without mercy. "I am trying to protect your dignity. But if you refuse to sign this document right now, you will leave me absolutely no choice. I will have to call Adult Protective Services. I will tell the state investigators that my elderly father is suffering from severe delusions and poses an active, immediate danger to himself. I will show them the canceled accounts, the frozen credit lines, and the paranoid security measures you have initiated. I will easily find a doctor willing to testify to your immediate cognitive decline." Lacey gave a slow nod and moved to his shoulder. "We will have to do it, Russell," she said, every trace of warmth scrubbed from her voice. "It will break our hearts, but we will have the state declare you legally incompetent." Derek held my gaze and drove the blade in further. "Do you have any idea what happens when the state takes over, Dad?" The question landed without any inflection of curiosity whatsoever. "They do not let you stay in this comfortable townhouse. They strip you of your independence entirely. They will place you in a state-run nursing facility. You will be locked in a sterile room on a secure ward. Strangers will run your days. They bring you your meals, and when you resist, they sedate you. Your entire estate will be liquidated by a court-appointed guardian to cover the cost of your confinement. You will lose absolutely everything. You will die alone in a hospital bed with no say over a single hour of what remains." He let that land, the silence over the frozen driveway doing the work. He was certain he had assembled my personal catastrophe with surgical precision. He believed he had located the marrow-deep fear that lives in every aging father and pressed the barrel directly against it. Sign the proxy, Dad. The gentleness was gone. The voice cracked out like a command. Sign the document right now. Let me take control of the banking, and I will let you stay in your house. I will let you keep your quiet little life. Fight me on this, and I swear to you I will have you committed by the end of the week. The morning held its silence around me. Another man, a normal father, would have buckled under the accumulated force of all of it, the psychological weight too much to carry upright. That man would have felt the terror of confinement closing in, of lost autonomy, of a locked ward as a final address. He would have doubted the reliability of his own recollection. He would have turned the past 2 days over in his mind, looking for the error. He'd have extended a shaking hand, accepted the pen, and surrendered his entire life on paper rather than lose the thin comfort of pretending his family was still his family. Terror was not what moved through me. What I felt was a cold, absolute confirmation of my adversary's total moral bankruptcy. Every vestige of the parent-child bond had been discarded. These were not family members. They were hostile actors threatening my freedom and my physical safety as leverage in a financial extraction scheme. They had just played the last card in their hand, gambling that the specter of institutionalization would make me fold. They had no conception that they were issuing ultimatums to a man who had already launched a sequence of actions that would render them homeless and staring down a brutal eviction notice before the calendar turned. Derek's chest rose and fell visibly, each breath hanging in the winter air between us. The threat of a permanent psychiatric commitment sat there like something with mass and weight. He watched my eyes for the collapse, for the moment I would fracture, bargain for my freedom, and yield everything to escape the cage he was describing. Lacey pressed in at his side, her expression arranged into a portrait of hungry expectation, waiting to watch me break. I gave them nothing. No flinch, no volume, no scrambling, self-justification, or pleading for quarter. I regarded them both the way a diagnostician regards a pathogen he has already neutralized, with complete clinical remove. The quality of that silence unsettled something in them. It moved across the frost-covered driveway and drained the aggression clean out of their posture. Before I turned to my son, I let my eyes settle first on his wife. Lacey went rigid the moment my gaze arrived. I was not looking at a daughter-in-law. I was conducting a line-item audit of misappropriated capital given a human shape. My assessment moved with unhurried, methodical precision. The expensive winter coat first. I placed the Italian designer label at the collar without difficulty, a current seasonal piece, the kind that circulates through high-end catalogs. I knew the price down to the dollar. Then her boots imported calfskin, the distinctive gold hardware catching what little light the gray morning offered. Then the heavy luxury handbag riding her shoulder. The numbers were already assembled in my head. I broke the silence with the flat precision of a ledger being read aloud. Your winter coat retails for $2,400. The words cut through the bitter wind without a tremor. Your leather boots cost $850. The handbag you are currently clutching is a limited production model that sells for approximately $4,200. You are standing on my concrete driveway, wearing nearly $7,500 worth of retail garments. You purchased these exact items during the holiday weekend using a joint platinum emergency card. Lacey's mouth came open, a flush of indignant rage climbing her neck. I did not give her a syllable of room. That specific credit line runs directly back to my personal retirement reserves. I continued, not a flicker of heat in my delivery. You did not earn that money, Lacey. You did not produce that capital. You pulled it out of my accounts on the confident assumption that I was too old and too mentally diminished to keep watch over my own financial architecture. You operated on the belief that you could siphon indefinitely from my resources to prop up a lifestyle neither of you could legitimately sustain. You are standing here humiliated because a piece of plastic was rejected at a boutique register, yet you feel no shame whatsoever about the fact that you are currently dressed in my stolen retirement. Lacey physically recoiled as though she'd taken a blow. Her mouth snapped shut. Every trace of the synthetic compassion she had performed moments before burned off, instantly replaced by raw, humiliated shock. She searched Derek's face for cover, but Derek had nothing to offer her. The mathematical precision of the audit had paralyzed him completely. There was no defense to mount against arithmetic that precise and that damning. I shifted my attention back to the man I had spent decades raising. Derek was watching me with a jaw locked tight and eyes that had begun filling with a dread he could not outrun. The boardroom son, the composed corporate bully who had held a nursing home over my head like a weapon, both gone. What remained was a man finally grasping the shape of the trap that had closed around him. He had come here armed with threats and found a demolition already completed. I reached into the deep breast pocket of my heavy cashmere overcoat, unhurried, deliberate. From it I drew a thick, rigid manila envelope, the paper stiff in the freezing cold. I suspended it above the hood of my idling vehicle and held it there. Derek stared at it the way you stare at something that might bite. Every instinct in him was broadcasting the same message: walk away, get back into the leased vehicle drive. But the hunger for control overrode the instinct for self-preservation. He had to know what I was holding. His fingers were shaking visibly as he reached out and took the envelope from my hand. Open it, I said quietly. Derek worked at the metal clasp with hands unsteady enough that he nearly lost the entire packet onto the frozen concrete. He finally tore the flap back and drew out a thick sheaf of stapled legal documents. He turned to the first, and his eyes moved across the bold lettering at the top. It was the formal fraud alert issued by the regional credit union, not a routine banking notification, but a severe, legally binding declaration that the $75,000 home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen on the basis of verified documented forgery. It stated explicitly that the electronic signature failed to match the physical records on file, and that the Federal Fraud Division had been formally notified of the discrepancy. The color left Derek's face in one motion. His cheeks went the gray of old concrete, hollowed out, drained. His lips separated but produced nothing. The understanding arrived in full. This was not a private secret between us. It was a documented, verifiable fact already residing on a federal banking server. He swallowed hard, his throat working against itself. A bead of sweat surfaced on his brow in spite of the freezing wind around him. Turn to the next document. My voice was a flat instrument. He folded the fraud alert back mechanically and exposed the second set of papers. It was the comprehensive binding contract of sale from Apex Capital Holdings. It named the exact property he currently occupied. It listed the aggressively discounted purchase price. And it bore my authorized physical signature executing the total liquidation of the asset. Derek's exhale came out in a shallow, ragged gasp. He read the corporate title of the investment firm. He read the aggressive 7-day closing timeline. The pages began to rattle in his grip, vibrating against the frozen air with enough force to be audible. His eyes came up to mine, emptied of every particle of the arrogance they had carried when he arrived. You sold the house. The words barely cleared his throat. You sold the house to a corporate liquidator. I sold a liability to an asset management firm. I returned, clipping the correction clean. They deal in hostile rapid cash acquisitions. The fact that you currently occupy the master bedroom is not a variable they account for. Your affluent neighbors do not factor into their models. Your country club standing carries no weight with them whatsoever. All they see is the land and the structure above it. You do not own that property, Derek. You never owned it. You occupied it on my generosity as a tenant, and you exhausted that generosity the moment you forged my name on a federal banking application. Read the final page. Derek turned to the last document in the stack. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises drafted by Gerald Paxton and legally bound to the acquisition contract. It declared his tenancy officially terminated, required the removal of all personal belongings, and specified that failure to comply would result in an aggressive corporate eviction carried out by the new legal owners. The totality of his defeat took physical form. Derek's knees visibly buckled. He put his weight against the side panel of his luxury SUV using the cold metal to keep himself vertical. The man who had arrived on my driveway, prepared to have me wheeled into a psychiatric ward, was gone without remainder, replaced by someone hollow broken, staring at the documented wreckage of everything he had constructed. Lacey craned over his shoulder and read the pages trembling in his hands. A sharp, strangled sound tore out of her. The entire architecture of the life she had curated, the wealthy suburban image, the designer labels, the illusion of arrival, collapsed in a single stroke. Their home, their credit, their standing, all of it liquidated simultaneously. They had raised a structure on a foundation of stolen capital, and I had simply removed the base. I felt no pity, not a grain. I had examined the accounts, identified the fraud, and executed the necessary liquidation. I looked directly into my son's bloodshot, terrified eyes. He was hyperventilating breath, arriving in short, clipped bursts, the full dimension of his ruin caving in on him from every direction. I delivered the final parameters of the reality he now occupied. No raised voice. No theatrics, no satisfaction bleeding into my tone. The weight I carried was the irreversible kind, the flat authority of a verdict already entered into the record. You are going to pack your things quietly, I said, holding his gaze with the kind of stillness that pins a man in place. Or the next document I place in your hand will be your federal indictment for forgery. I did not linger for his response. I did not wait for Lacey to dissolve into the collar of her stolen coat. I turned, walked to my front door, unlocked it, and stepped into the quiet interior of my townhouse. The door closed behind me with a solid mechanical click, the freezing air, and the frantic breathing of the two people on my driveway sealed to the outside. I turned the brass deadbolt with one smooth motion. I did not retreat deeper into the house seeking distance or comfort. I positioned myself in the shadowed foyer and observed the fallout through the narrow vertical glass panels flanking the entrance, a silent witness to the implosion of everything they had built. It was Lacey who broke first. Her voice came through the insulated glass, not as language, but as a raw, feral shriek, the sound of something cornered with no exit. She hurled her heavy designer handbag onto the iced concrete where it scraped and skidded across the surface. She began moving back and forth across the driveway in the tight, frantic pattern of an animal that has run out of room. She screamed at the face of my house, her features twisted into something unrecognizable by fury. She swore she would dismantle me. She promised the most aggressive corporate litigators in the state would be retained to bankrupt my estate and drag my name into the gutter. She vowed to poison my reputation among every former professional peer I had and pry loose every asset I had ever accumulated. Through the cold glass, I watched her unravel entirely unmoved by the spectacle. She was operating without leverage and simply couldn't process that fact. There was no capital available to retain expensive attorneys. Her credit lines had been permanently frozen. Her assets were effectively seized, and her husband was staring down a federal felony indictment. She was shrieking into a void that had already consumed her, the the final convulsive thrashing of a parasite cut loose from its host. Derek made no move to rein her in. He stood apart from the legal documents scattered across the hood of his leased vehicle. The terror that had flooded his eyes moments ago had curdled into something harder, a cold, rigid panic of a very specific kind. The kind that makes a drowning man shove his rescuer below the surface just to steal one more breath. His physical intimidation had collapsed. His gaslighting operation had accomplished nothing. The documented proof of his own forgery had sealed every exit. He was cornered, and he needed something nuclear, an overwhelming external force capable of breaking through my defenses before the corporate liquidators showed up next week to put him physically on the street. I watched through the glass as Derek thrust a hand into his suit jacket and produced his cellular phone. His fingers were trembling badly enough that he nearly fumbled the device onto the frozen concrete. He did not dial a criminal defense attorney to limit his exposure. He did not attempt a desperate call to his bank. He pressed 3 digits and put the phone to his ear. He moved aggressively toward my front porch, eyes fixed on the door between us. His voice bled through the glass, not the broken, desperate register of a ruined man, but something else entirely. He had manufactured hysteria from nothing. He was crying, actual tears forced into his delivery as he pleaded with the emergency dispatcher on the other end of the line. He called for immediate police and medical assistance at my address. He gave his full name and my exact location, with the frantic precision of someone who had rehearsed exactly this. Then he began constructing a masterwork of weaponized fiction fed directly into the civil response system. He told the dispatcher his elderly father was in the grip of a violent, catastrophic dementia episode, weaving the lie with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years bending reality to his advantage. He claimed I had broken entirely from rational thought, that I was consumed by severe and aggressive hallucinations. He screamed that I had barricaded myself inside, disabled the security system, and was actively threatening to harm myself and anyone who tried to reach me. He sketched out the image of a deeply disturbed geriatric patient locked in paranoid delusion, shouting about corporate conspiracies and stolen bank funds. He begged the dispatcher to move fast, insisting I might set the townhouse ablaze or launch a physical assault the moment anyone attempted to intervene. Lacey registered the pivot instantly. The hysterical shrieking stopped, and she folded herself smoothly into his performance. She gripped Derek's arm and began sobbing toward the phone loudly, deliberately making certain her wailing was captured by the emergency dispatch recording. She begged the invisible operator to send an ambulance before I did something irreversible. They were attempting to deploy the state as a personal enforcement mechanism. Derek had calculated his play precisely if he could sell the arriving authorities on the image of a violent, schizophrenic old man barricaded inside a dark house. They would breach the door, strap me to a gurney, and drop me into an involuntary psychiatric hold. With me locked in a hospital under a mandatory 72-hour evaluation, he would have the operational window he needed, file the fraudulent power of attorney, circumvent the property sale, and drain whatever liquid assets remained before anyone identified him as the actual criminal. It was the apex of his escalation. He was using my age and society's reflexive assumptions as instruments against me. He counted on the responding officers to naturally side with a visibly distraught, well-dressed corporate son over a silent old man sealed behind a dark door. I did not panic. I did not rush to gather documents or assemble a frantic rebuttal. I stayed where I was in the quiet shadow of the foyer, breathing slow and measured, watching Derek circle the frost-covered lawn while keeping up his performance for the dispatcher. He was checking his watch timing, the estimated response calculating how long before the first cruiser turned onto the block. I knew precisely what the arriving officers would find. They would approach expecting chaos, aggression, and cognitive wreckage. What they would encounter was a calm, lucid retired executive in possession of documented federal wire fraud, committed by the man weeping on the driveway. Derek hadn't summoned a rescue team. He had summoned his own arresting officers and delivered them directly to the scene of his crime. The bitter wind continued to move across the empty street, carrying with it the full weight of what was about to conclude. My breathing stayed even. Then I heard it faint at first, a high-pitched wail slicing through the gray, frozen air. It multiplied and swelled, bouncing off the surrounding houses as several emergency vehicles accelerated down the main boulevard toward my address. Red and blue light began strobing weakly across the frost-covered trees at the end of the block. Derek lowered his phone and fixed his gaze on my front door, his expression soaked in toxic triumph. He genuinely believed the sirens meant he had won. I stayed motionless in the shadow, waiting for those lights to finish illuminating my son's destruction. The vehicles arrived hard and fast, the flashing red and blue strobing off the frost on my front windows. 2 heavy police cruisers blocked the street completely. A dull gray sedan pulled in directly behind them. 4 uniformed officers stepped onto the frozen asphalt, hands resting casually on their utility belts. A woman climbed out of the sedan, sensible dark winter coat, thick plastic clipboard, the measured and tired efficiency of someone who conducted these calls for a living. I already knew who she was. Yvonne Reeves from Adult Protective Services. Derek didn't wait for them to reach the property. He threw himself across the frozen lawn to cut them off, and as he moved, something shifted in him completely. The rigid, panicked posture evaporated. His shoulders caved forward. He buried his face in both hands and let his body shake with manufactured grief. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and wet. A loud, choked sob pushed out of him and carried clean through the cold air. It was a clinical performance, precise, calculated, and utterly without conscience. "Officer, please, you have to help us." Derek's voice fractured on cue. "My father is inside. He has completely lost his mind." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Yvonne Reeves stepped forward and clicked her pen, asking Derek to walk her through the situation. He built the portrait. Stroke by stroke, a sudden catastrophic mental collapse. A father who had been missing appointments and behaving strangely all week. He told her that when he arrived, I was unrecognizable, gripped by severe, rapid-onset dementia and violent paranoid delusions. He thinks everyone is trying to rob him. Derek forced another tear down his cheek. He is hallucinating about stolen money and federal bank fraud. He is shouting about corporate conspiracies and forged signatures. We tried to reach him, but he turned aggressive. He threatened to attack my wife. He locked himself inside and cut the security system. I am terrified he is going to hurt himself or accidentally set the property on fire. Please, you have to commit him. You have to get him to a secure hospital right now. Lacey wove herself into the performance without a seam. She pressed herself against Derek's side arms, cinched around his waist, face buried in his shoulder. Her body shook with what she wanted to look like trauma. She told Yvonne Reeves in a trembling whisper that I had lunged at her through the doorway when she had done nothing more than try to hand me a cup of coffee, that my eyes had been completely vacant, that I couldn't even recall my own name. I watched their synchronized performance from the stillness of my dark foyer. What I felt was a cold, clinical recognition of the depths they were willing to descend to. This wasn't ordinary lying. They were surgically exploiting the state's established protocols for elderly welfare, using them as instruments of attack. They understood that authorities dispatched to these calls arrived preloaded with expectations of cognitive collapse. They were feeding Yvonne Reeves every clinical buzzword calibrated to trigger an involuntary psychiatric hold: paranoia, hallucinations, aggressive behavior. imminent danger to self and others. Derek understood that if the officers accepted his version of events, there would be no polite knock. They would breach the door. They would put me in restraints, strap me to a medical gurney, and transport me to a locked psychiatric ward for a mandatory 72-hour evaluation. That 3-day window was the entire point. With me chemically sedated and legally confined, he would file the fraudulent power of attorney and empty every liquid asset I owned before the acquisition firm could complete the eviction. He was running the police as his personal extraction unit. Yvonne Reeves listened to Derek weep, nodding, with what appeared to be sympathy, and made several entries on her clipboard. She turned to the 4 officers and indicated my townhouse with a gesture. Their body language shifted immediately from casual to tactical. Flashlights were unclipped, and they started up my concrete driveway boots grinding against the frozen surface. Derek tracked their approach from beside his vehicle. He drew Lacey close to him, but the cold, settled triumph in his posture was unmistakable even through the glass. He believed the operation had worked. He believed the authorities were about to remove his problem from the equation permanently. The officers reached my front porch and arranged themselves on the other side of the door, braced for a raving, disheveled old man drowning in violent hallucination. They were expecting noise and chaos. I did not retreat. I did not conceal myself deeper in the house. I smoothed the lapels of my cashmere overcoat and took one slow, even breath. I placed my hand on the cold brass deadbolt and prepared to dismantle everything they had constructed. I didn't wait for the knock to land. I turned the deadbolt and drew the door open at the precise moment Yvonne Reeves raised her fist to rap on the wood. She stopped cold on the frosted threshold. The 4 officers on the walkway behind her instinctively shifted their hands toward their utility belts. Every muscle primed for a violent physical confrontation with an erratic elderly man. I gave them nothing to work with. I stood in the doorway in tailored wool trousers and a crisply pressed dress shirt, regarding the lead investigator with a composed and unhurried expression. I offered a mild smile. I told her it was far too cold to be standing on the freezing concrete and invited her inside, mentioning that I had a fresh pot of peppermint tea on if she'd like to warm up. The investigator's hand lowered. Her gaze swept across my face and my clothing, hunting for the severe cognitive wreckage my son had just described in hysterical detail out on the driveway. She had expected a confused and disheveled man in the grip of violent paranoid delusion. She found a calm, retired corporate logistics executive, holding his front door open with steady, unblemished composure. She glanced back over her shoulder at Derek. He was still leaning against his luxury vehicle, with Lacey pressed against him, waiting for the officers to haul me out in medical restraints. The investigator turned back, studied me for a moment longer, and gave a slow nod. She directed the 4 officers to hold their position on the front porch and stepped across the threshold into my foyer. I brought her through to the formal dining room at an unhurried pace, the deliberate, measured movement of a man who has full command of his surroundings. I pulled out one of the heavy mahogany chairs for her, then went into the kitchen and returned with 2 cups of hot water from the kettle I had set to boil earlier that morning, having anticipated this exact sequence of events well in advance. I set a cup in front of her and took my seat across the table. She didn't touch the tea. She unclipped her pen from the clipboard, settled her gaze on me with a mixture of professional wariness and visible confusion, and introduced herself, Yvonne Reeves, legally obligated to investigate a priority report regarding my immediate mental deterioration and the potential danger I posed to public safety. I held her gaze without interruption. I told her I understood her position completely and had full respect for what her duty required her to do. I mentioned that my son Derek had almost certainly delivered a compelling and highly emotional account of my sudden catastrophic loss of mental faculties, probably including vivid references to delusions about stolen funds and forged banking documents. Yvonne gave a slow nod, her eyes narrowing, as she worked to reconcile the sobbing wreck on the driveway with the perfectly articulate man sitting across from her. I reached beneath the polished surface of the mahogany table and brought up a thick, leather-bound binder, which I set quietly beside her teacup. I did not mount an emotional defense of my character. I did not speak about betrayal or broken trust. I simply slid the binder across the table and asked her to open it. She lifted the cover. The first document waiting inside was not a financial record or a deed. It was a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation printed on the official watermarked letterhead of the most prestigious cognitive behavioral clinic in the state. The evaluation was exhaustive, rigorous memory testing, cognitive retention exams complex, psychological profiling, and the final page bore the signature of the chief medical director, formally certifying that my mental acuity was entirely unimpaired and that I retained full, uncompromised capacity to manage my own financial and legal affairs. Yvonne's eyes dropped to the date stamped across the top of the document. She looked up at me and I watched the shift happen, cautious confusion giving way to a much deeper understanding. I took a measured sip of tea. I told her I had proactively arranged and completed that full psychiatric evaluation exactly 3 days ago. Earlier that week, I explained I had quietly audited our shared family server and uncovered digital search records showing Derek actively researching attorneys who specialized in involuntary guardianship proceedings and emergency power of attorney petitions. The moment I froze his fraudulent credit lines, I knew his retaliation would come in exactly this form, an attempt to weaponize the state against my autonomy, to use my age as the instrument of a hostile legal takeover. I had simply obtained the undeniable medical documentation needed to neutralize that attack, before he had even worked up the nerve to dial the emergency dispatcher. Yvonne Reeves closed the leather binder. The soft, decisive click of the cover carried through the quiet dining room. She did not raise a single further question about my mental state. She did not ask me to recall the date or run through a basic memory exercise. 20 pages of unassailable medical record had collapsed Derek's fictional account entirely. She turned her gaze toward the front window, where the red and blue strobing from the police cruisers still played across the glass. The realization settled over her face she had been expertly maneuvered. The hysterical weeping man on the driveway was not a frightened son trying to protect his father. He was a cornered predator attempting to weaponize her legal authority to bury a serious financial crime. I leaned forward and rested my hands flat on the mahogany table. There were several other documents in that binder requiring her immediate attention, I told her. The verified evidence of the forged $75,000 home equity line of credit. The digital timestamps, establishing that Derek had illegally routed the stolen funds into his private accounts. The executed contract of sale for his current residence and the formal termination of his tenancy. The full, unvarnished record of his criminality, organized and complete inside a single leather binder. I asked her to bring the 4 officers inside so we could formally discuss the immediate arrest of the man currently standing on my driveway without permission. Yvonne turned the heavy parchment page of the psychiatric evaluation in silence. The dining room was absolutely still, the only sound the faint ticking of the antique barometer clock on the mantel. I watched her eyes move methodically through the documents I had assembled in the leather binder. The professionally neutral mask she wore began to come apart as the raw data registered. I reached across the polished mahogany table and tapped the corner of a bank statement flagged in sharp fluorescent yellow. That document, I explained, traced the exact routing numbers of the fraudulent $75,000 home equity line of credit. I watched the tip of her pen follow the flow of capital. The funds had not settled in any account bearing my name. They had been wired immediately into a private wealth management portfolio under the independent control of my son and his wife. I directed her attention to the final section of the binder. When I first discovered the unauthorized credit inquiry, I explained I had not simply frozen the account. I had contacted the regional fraud division of the credit union and requested the complete digital footprint of the application. I slid a rigid sheet of paper toward her, a string of complex numerical values. I told Yvonne that the electronic signature authorizing the loan had been generated from a specific Internet protocol address. I watched her read the physical location mapped to that digital address. It had not originated from my home network. The digital fingerprint traced directly and without ambiguity to the exact residential coordinates of the property Derek currently occupied. A perfect self-contained digital confession of federal wire fraud executed from his own living room. The entire narrative inside that dining room flipped in a single moment. Yvonne Reeves stopped reading. She settled back in the mahogany chair, and the weary, sympathetic posture of a social worker dissolved on the spot. What replaced it was something colder and far sharper, the focused attention of a professional staring at a textbook prosecution. She was no longer sitting across from a vulnerable elderly man in cognitive decline. She was looking directly at a felony-level elder financial exploitation case. The fiction of a devoted son fighting to save his deteriorating father came apart completely. The sheer audacity of the man still performing grief on my driveway came into full focus. Her jaw tightened as the insult to her professional judgment crystallized. Derek had deliberately brought her here. He had tried to convert her agency into a weapon, to use her legal authority as a blunt instrument, to have a perfectly competent man confined in a psychiatric ward, buying himself the operational window to complete his theft. He had assumed she would accept his manufactured tears without demanding a single piece of verifiable evidence. He had bet he could hide his crime inside the machinery of the state. Yvonne stood up from the table. She did not touch the peppermint tea. She closed the leather binder and drew it firmly against her chest, securing it as official state evidence. She looked down at me with an expression of complete and unambiguous professional respect. She told me she had investigated hundreds of cases involving entitled family members stripping assets from aging parents. She said she had encountered every conceivable manipulation a greedy adult child could devise. Then she said in a quiet and even voice that she had never once watched a predator walk this blindly and this arrogantly into his own meticulously prepared destruction. She moved away from the table down the hallway toward the foyer. The 4 officers were still on the front porch, bodies, taut hands close to their utility belts, fully prepared to enter the house and physically subdue a violent, delusional patient. Yvonne pulled the door open. Freezing air pushed through the threshold and into the warm house. Derek looked up immediately. His face still carried the residue of manufactured tears, his posture still arranged in an attitude of devastated helplessness. He was waiting to watch me brought out in medical restraints. He expected Yvonne to offer him a nod of confirmation. His father secured his financial future clear. Yvonne Reeves stepped out onto the porch alone. The sympathy was gone from her expression, entirely replaced by the cold, unhurried gaze of someone who had just cornered exactly what she was looking for. She turned to the lead officer and extended one rigid finger directly at my son. She instructed the officers to detain Derek immediately on suspicion of felony elder financial abuse and federal wire fraud. Derek's manufactured sobbing stopped. He straightened, wiping his eyes, expecting her to deliver the legal authorization he needed. He was waiting for the order to breach the house and extract his father. Instead, she came down the short porch steps and stopped directly in front of him. "Your father is in perfect physical and mental health." Yvonne's voice carried no warmth whatsoever. "He is entirely competent to manage his own legal and financial affairs. I have just reviewed a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation executed 3 days ago by a board-certified medical director." Derek opened his mouth to claim the evaluation was fabricated to protest to manufacture some new angle, but Yvonne raised a single hand and shut him down without a word. "I also reviewed the verified bank logs and the Internet Protocol timestamps regarding a $75,000 home equity line of credit." Each word landed with the weight of something final. "Adult Protective Services is formally opening a criminal investigation into you and your wife for felony elder financial exploitation and federal wire fraud. I have already contacted the district attorney to expedite the warrants." The lead officer moved forward, one hand settling deliberately on his utility belt. He looked Derek over with undisguised contempt. He informed Derek that he was officially trespassing on private property. He stated clearly that if Derek or his wife ever set foot on this driveway again, they would leave in handcuffs. He ordered them to get in their vehicle and vacate the premises immediately. The moment the authorities turned against them, the last thread holding their alliance together snapped. Stripped of all leverage and staring down the corridor toward federal prison, Derek and Lacey turned on each other in the middle of the street. Lacey struck Derek hard on the shoulder. She shrieked that he was an absolute idiot for running the forgery through his own home network. She screamed that he had destroyed her life and leveled their social standing because he was too incompetent to execute a simple white-collar crime. Derek's face collapsed into pure, hateful rage. He screamed back that he had only forged the documents to cover her crushing, suffocating credit card debts. He shouted that her relentless appetite for luxury and her demands had driven them into bankruptcy. I stood behind the glass of my front window and watched their marriage come apart piece by piece. They were no longer a coordinated front of financial predators. They were two exposed, panicked criminals shredding each other in the freezing wind, unable to bear the weight of their own uncovered greed. 30 days burned off with the merciless efficiency of a closing deadline. The corporate asset management firm that had acquired the sprawling property in Ballantyne outside Charlotte did not negotiate extensions. They had no interest in Lacey's social calendar or Derek's frantic scramble to find legal representation. On the morning of the 30th day, the heavy tires of a county sheriff's vehicle rolled across the familiar frozen gravel of the driveway. I was not there in person to observe the removal, but the formal reports from the corporate liquidators and the neighborhood association assembled a detailed and bleak picture. Derek and Lacey had refused to pack their belongings. They had clung to the delusion that some last-minute legal injunction would materialize and spare them. They were wrong. The sheriff's deputies offered no extensions and no sympathy. They gave a strict 10-minute window to collect essential personal effects before the locks were changed. The sprawling property Derek had tried to steal was formally secured by men in tactical uniforms, while Lacey stood on the cold sidewalk, weeping into a cheap cardboard box, the gilded suburban illusion disintegrating in plain sight of every affluent neighbor they had spent years trying to impress. The moment Adult Protective Services launched their investigation, a swift and ruinous financial chain reaction followed. Yvonne Reeves executed her role with the kind of cold precision that left no room for error. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was confirmed, and federal banking authorities moved immediately. Every joint account tied to Derek and Lacey was locked down for good. Every dollar they had stolen from me sat sealed inside a federal evidence vault untouchable until a full criminal trial could run its course. Their credit ratings, which had only ever stayed afloat because of the quiet capital I'd been pumping into their lives, cratered without warning. Once my retirement funds were no longer serving as an invisible cushion beneath them, the full wreckage of their finances became impossible to hide. The debt they carried was enormous and unpayable. Not a cent of liquid reserves existed between them. Every reputable leasing agency in the state slammed its door the moment their names came up. With stolen wealth now frozen and a felony case hanging over their heads, every road forward simply closed. Finding a landlord willing to take them meant going to someone operating entirely outside normal channels, a subprime operator who asked no questions and ran no checks. The wide-groomed streets and understated elegance of the neighborhood they'd occupied were gone, replaced by the cracked pavement and rusted chain link of an industrial sector on the city's far edge. What they moved into was a tight, deteriorating two-bedroom unit perched directly above a commercial laundromat that ran around the clock. The walls were nearly translucent with age and blotched with years of accumulated neglect. The oversized designer pieces they'd bought on my dime couldn't even be wrestled through the building's narrow, rotting entry. Everything got left on the pavement, picked clean by passers-by within the hour. As the wire transfer from the cash buyer settled into my private account, I felt something deep and final lock into place, a sense of closure that was total and clean. That suburban property had been a dead weight hanging from my financial structure for too long. Now it was liquid capital secured behind protocols Derek would never come close to touching again. The line connecting us had been cut at the root. I sat with the thought of them on the stained floor of that wretched unit, the constant mechanical drone of washing machines vibrating up through the ceiling above them, and I felt nothing resembling guilt. This was the unfiltered truth of the life they had chosen. These were the returns on the decisions they had made. For 30-odd years, I had stood between my son and the fallout of his own recklessness, absorbing blow after blow on his behalf. I had settled debts he never acknowledged. I had underwrote a lifestyle built entirely on my generosity. I had let his sense of entitlement go unchecked year after year in silence. That chapter had reached its end. What had happened to them was not punishment handed down from above. It was equilibrium reasserting itself. It was what happens when you trade your own blood for a better balance sheet. The stillness inside my townhouse held, disturbed only by the faint, steady rhythm of the antique barometer clock on the mantel. The afternoon light had gone thin and pale, the winter sun sinking toward the rooftops and drawing long, quiet shadows across the hardwood. I was deep in my leather reading chair, a warm mug of dark coffee resting in my hand, when my phone buzzed hard against the side table once then again, rattling the wood and throwing a pale glow across the room. I looked at the screen. A number I hadn't seen in exactly 1 month was on the display. Derek. The call was coming from a prepaid handset, a near certainty given that his corporate account had almost certainly been cut for non-payment long before now. I made no move to answer. I watched the light pulse against the wood with the same detachment you'd give a weather report for a city you'd never visit. Another man in my position might have felt his stomach tighten at the sight, some reflex of parental duty surging back to life. I experienced none of that, just the slow, even pull of my own breath. I reached over, touched the screen, and took the call. No hello. His name didn't cross my lips. I held the phone to my ear and said nothing, offering only silence as an invitation for him to speak first. What came through the speaker stopped me cold, not because it shocked me, but because of how pitiable it was. Broken, soaking wet, sobbing. Derek was crying the way a man cries when there is absolutely nothing left beneath him, when rock bottom has already given way. "Dad, please." The word came out fractured, dissolving into a thin, desperate whine. "Please, you have to help us." Gone was any trace of the polished, condescending authority he'd deployed on my driveway that morning, months ago. No veiled threats about psychiatric holds or state intervention made an appearance. The man who had once stood on my property issuing ultimatums had been ground completely flat by the consequences of his own making. Nothing remained. He talked into the phone in a broken stream, laying out the state of his new apartment in punishing detail, the vibrations that never stopped bleeding up from the laundromat, below the cold air, pushing through cracked and fractured window glass. He wept as he told me that Lacey had filled garbage bags with what was left of her wardrobe and walked out the night before, gone back to her family's house, every one of his calls going to voicemail. He had no money, no allies, and a federal indictment assembling itself just over the horizon. I gave him no interruption. I let the silence on my end stay total while he ran out of breath. I let him pour it all through the line until there was nothing left to spill. What he was searching for was a single word from me, something soft, something that would let him believe the old pattern could still hold, that I would reach down one more time and pull him clear of the hole he'd dug. That reflex had been retired. The longer my silence stretched, the more his voice came apart at the seams. "Dad, I know I made a terrible mistake." He choked words, barely holding shape through the crying. "I know I crossed a line, but the landlord here is demanding a 3-month security deposit in cash by tomorrow morning. If I do not pay him, he is going to throw me out on the street. I have nothing left, Dad. My accounts are permanently frozen. My credit is completely ruined. I cannot even buy groceries. I am begging you just a temporary loan, just $5,000 to keep a roof over my head until I can figure this out and find a lawyer. I will pay you back every single penny. I swear to you on my life. Please do not let me become homeless." Every word of it hung in the calm, still air of my living room. I didn't move. Phone cold against my ear. My mind went back to that frozen morning on my driveway. I saw again the look on his face as he pushed that forged power of attorney into my hands. Something sharp and calculated behind the eyes, no warmth anywhere in it. I heard again the flat certainty in his voice as he told me he'd have me committed to a locked ward if I didn't fall in line, all of it, in service of getting his hands on my retirement. He had been ready to hollow out my life completely just to keep his own afloat. He had looked at this man who built everything he'd ever had and registered only an obstacle standing between him and a cash withdrawal. I pulled in a long breath, slow and deliberate. The air inside my home was still and warm. My life was intact and entirely my own. I let the silence break on my terms. When I spoke, there was nothing in my voice, no heat, no grief, not the faintest tremor of unresolved feeling. It landed with the kind of finality you don't appeal. "I am sorry, Derek," I said, and I used the precise clinical phrase he had turned against me on my own front step. I only planned for my immediate family. I didn't give him the moment of registering it. I didn't wait to hear whatever sound followed those words landing. The red icon, one tap, and the call was gone. I went into the phone settings and found his contact. One press of my thumb, and the block was in place. That channel was closed in every direction, permanently. The phone went back to the side table. I brought the mug to my lips and drank. Quiet reclaimed the townhouse, draping itself across the room with the weight of something earned. Later, I found myself on the porch, as darkness settled in around the neighborhood, unhurried and complete. The brutal cold snap that had gripped the last month had finally eased off, leaving behind a still, clear winter evening. The street lamps came on one by one, spilling warm, amber light across the clean, empty pavement below. I took no pleasure in what had become of my son. No part of this felt like a victory to celebrate. What I carried was something quieter and more durable than the deep, grounded peace of a system back in balance. My world had been thrown violently off its axis by greed and an entitlement so vast it had become invisible to the person carrying it. But measured action and the willingness to cut what needed cutting had restored it. I hadn't brought Derek down. I had only removed myself from the equation, stepped aside, and let the full mass of his choices descend onto the only set of shoulders that had always belonged beneath them. He was not a child. He was a man living inside the exact consequences his own adult decisions had built. I pushed up from the chair and went back inside into the warmth and quiet of my home. I crossed to my small mahogany desk and lifted the laptop open. The glow of the screen lit my face in the darkened room. I pulled up my secured banking portal and ran my eyes down the digital ledger. The substantial proceeds from the finalized cash sale of the suburban property sat untouched in my primary account. Joined by the recovered funds, Yvonne Reeves had methodically clawed back from Derek's frozen accounts throughout the federal investigation. Every dollar of the wealth I had spent a lifetime assembling through decades of honest grinding work was accounted for and whole. It was no longer a target sitting open for someone else to drain. It was no longer a guarded secret I had to keep hidden from my own family. It belonged to me completely and without question. I opened a fresh browser tab and brought up a premium international travel agency. Budget fares and discount lodging were not what I was after. For 40 years, I had set my own wants aside, making sure the people around me had every advantage I could provide. I had deferred my own life to bankroll their comfort and indulgence. That era of self-erasure was now closed permanently and without appeal. I entered my details into the booking portal. I chose a first-class itinerary spanning a full month in Europe. I built a private, unhurried route through the ancient stone streets of Rome, across the open vineyard country of Tuscany, and along the sweeping coastal roads of the Mediterranean. Luxury suites in historic five-star properties were secured for each leg, along with private transit for the full journey. The loading icon turned for just a moment before bold green confirmation text filled the screen. The itinerary was locked in. What lay ahead was entirely mine to shape. I closed the laptop and moved toward the front of the townhouse. A sleek black town car was already at the curb, its headlights sweeping pale light across the frost-covered lawn. The driver, dressed in a dark suit, stepped out and opened the trunk, standing quietly in the cold. I took my heavy cashmere overcoat from the closet and settled it across my shoulders. I lifted my premium leather travel bag from the foyer floor. I didn't cast a look back at the dark, still house behind me. I moved out onto the front porch and drew the heavy, solid oak door closed. The brass deadbolt turned with a sharp, definitive click that rang out across the quiet street. Every toxic element had been excised from my life with surgical precision. The lines I had drawn were fixed and would not bend. I followed the concrete path down to the waiting car, breathing in the cold, clean night air. I was a man who had passed through a profound betrayal and come out the other side without a crack in him. I settled into the warm leather interior and told the driver to head straight to the airport. As we pulled from the curb and eased into the light flow of traffic, I watched the city lights drift past the window. The weight of manipulation and corrosive greed was falling away behind me with every block. The engine ran low and steady, carrying me towards something new. The reckoning had run its course. My life had returned to me. The lesson woven through all of it is this real love cannot exist without firm, unwavering limits. When a parent absorbs every consequence their child was meant to face, they don't protect them. They build something monstrous in their place. Real strength isn't found in endless giving. It's found in the willingness to stand aside and let the weight of reality do what it must. Reclaiming your peace sometimes means cutting away the people who read your generosity as an invitation to take everything. Hold that line, and what remains is yours, your dignity, your quiet, your life. If you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you. That means something to me. Looking back at everything that unfolded. The Christmas Eve door closed in my face. The stolen equity, the forged signatures, the phone call from a man who had become a stranger wearing my son's voice. I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. It did. Betrayal at that level from your own child costs you something you don't fully get back. But I believe God places a moment of clarity in front of every person who has been pushed past their limit. Mine came quietly in the middle of the night, with a document I was never meant to see. And when it came, I was ready. These are the things I want you to take with you from this story. If someone treats your generosity as a weakness to exploit withdrawing, it is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. Document everything. The truth you can prove is the only truth that protects you when family becomes the threat. Love your children fiercely, but never let that love become a shield that keeps them from the weight of their own choices. When you sense something is wrong, trust that instinct and move quietly. The time for confrontation comes later and on your terms. These are the kinds of father stories that don't get told enough, the ones about men who finally stopped absorbing the damage and chose themselves instead. Family justice doesn't always look the way we imagined it would when our children were small. Sometimes it looks like a blocked number and a first-class ticket to somewhere you've always wanted to go. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you took from it. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories, there are more stories coming, and I don't want you to miss them. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself.